for the Board of Selectmen, and I am told that the cookies are downstairs, and you better get them quick. If I may, Mr. Moderator, I note that like last time, by 8 o'clock, they had disappeared.
Okay, enough of this frivolity. Let's move on to the business of the meeting. Quiet, please. I have a couple of announcements before we start. There's a new vote tally on the appropriation for the Baldwin School. A changed vote. 184 in favor, 32 opposed, and 4 abstentions. We have an issue that came up this morning concerning budget item 53, which is a $300,000 appropriation for improvements to the water system, and it is a bonding appropriation, but the bonding authorization was not included in the item. The green sheets that you received at the teller's tables, at the checkers tables this evening, are an amended motion. The first thing tomorrow evening, I believe we're doing to the third session, I will ask for a motion to reconsider that item, and we will deal with it. The motion will likely pass, and we'll revote that item. This is not reopening the entire budget. It's just for item 53. So that will occur first thing tomorrow evening. Let me say just a word on my policy on abstentions. Obviously, if you have an electronic or a recorded vote, the abstentions are recorded and become part of the record. If you want to abstain on a voice vote or a hand vote, I don't normally call for abstentions for either of that type of vote. And for to be recorded in the record as abstaining, just give your name to the town clerk, and he will make sure that the minutes of the meeting will record you as having abstained from the motion. I have, unfortunately, some disciplinary issues to discuss. I'm informed that during the town clerk's reading of the roll of deceased town meeting members, there was some chatter going on in the auditorium, and that's entirely inappropriate, as I'm sure you realize, and I hope we don't have a recurrence of that. Equally important, during a couple of the presentations on the Baldwin School, there were loud, and I didn't pick them up, but there were apparently comments from the opposition and taking issue with whatever the speaker was saying. And when somebody's speaking in this town meeting, I expect all of you to be quiet and listen. I don't want any comments or gestures or anything like that. And as I pointed out last night, I don't want any applause during a presentation. So notwithstanding my admonition at the beginning of the meeting, we had those at least 2 or 3 instances that I didn't pick up during the meeting, which were showed a lack of discipline and decorum on your part. But by and large, you did very well last night under somewhat strenuous conditions. Tonight, because of the 2 motions that we entertained before we started the first session, We will hear the following articles in the following order. We will start out with Article 12. We will then deal with Article 20, then Article 23, and then we'll start with Article 10 and do them in numerical order thereafter. So we start with Article 12. The motion under Article 12 is, which is found on pages 12-4 to 12-7 of the purple supplement. I'm sorry, it's pages 6, 7, and 8, 6 through 9 of the purple supplement. Moved by Ms. Allaire, seconded by Ms. Humphrey, that the town create a new bylaw for the Brookline Commission on Disability. Ms. Allaire?
Good evening. I'm Sarah Lynn Allaire, a town meeting member from Precinct 16 and chair of the Brookline Commission on Disability. It's the full commission that's the petitioner for this article. And besides me, there's Myra Burloff, Ben Franco, Robert Heist, Ann Kamensky, Joan Mahone, James Mishek, Elaine Ober, and Henry Winkleman. And Caitlin Haynes is the town's Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator, and I want to thank her for her help and support with this article. The object of Article 12 is to see if the town will vote to create a new article in the town's general bylaws. The article will establish the Brookline Commission on Disability under the town's general bylaws and establish principles and procedures for the governance of the commission. Now, the commission is already in existence, and it has been since way back in 1986, when the town meeting voted to accept state law that enabled communities to establish commissions on disability. We looked at the record of that article. It was Article 25, and we saw that surprisingly it consisted of one sentence: to see if the town will vote to accept the provisions of General Laws, Chapter 40, Section 8J, which calls for an establishment of a local disability commission. Now, the commissioners think that it's important for the commission to be established within the town's bylaws for these reasons: to increase awareness of its existence, and we note that all other commissions in Brookline are established in the bylaws; to confirm and clarify its role in town government, and to enable all to know what the commission is empowered to do and what the rules and procedures are. We used serious material in developing this article, specifically a model bylaw developed by the Massachusetts Office on Disability and used in the past by many other communities. The version before you is amended in these ways. Recently updated Chapter 40, Section 8J language is included. Superfluous material has been removed. The meeting notification time has been reduced from 14 to 2 days, and the town official member has been specified to a selectman or department head. I'll review the bylaw now just briefly. Establishment and purpose. I told you what the purpose of the article is. The purpose of the commission is to bring about integration and participation of people with disabilities in Brookline town affairs. The commission works in conjunction with the Office on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, and the town's ADA coordinator is an ex officio member of the commission. Definitions. The definition of a person with a disability is the definition used in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Powers and duties, there are 14 of these, and I certainly am not going to go over all of them. Two show what the actual a broad range of entities that the commission addresses. Number two is advise and assist municipal officials and employees in disability law compliance. And number five is provide information and technical assistance to individuals, businesses, and organizations on disability issues. I'll review three of the duties of the commission. One is to write and review periodically a mission statement, prepare and periodically review goals for the commission, and to file an annual report in the town's annual report. Officers, there are four: chairperson, deputy chairperson, secretary, and treasurer, and these are elected by commission members. Membership, there are 7 or 9 members, most with a disability or a family member with such, and members are chosen by the Board of Selectmen.
You have 1 minute.
There are 3-year staggered terms for members. There are a minimum of 10 meetings per year. The quorum is a majority of members. The minutes are to be reviewed, approved, and posted in a timely manner. And decisions are made by a majority present. So in conclusion, members of the Brookline Commission on Disability ask you to vote in favor of Article 12. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Humphrey.
Sitska Humphrey, Precinct 6, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. Let me get this. Can you hear me now? All right. As Sarah Lynn already mentioned, in 1986, town meeting voted to establish what was then called a local handicapped commission. They are in their 31st year, have been operating without being having bylaws that are part of our Brookline general bylaws. So Warrant Article 12 will enable the Commission to carry out all of its programs in coordination with programs of the Massachusetts Office on Disability to bring about full and equal participation in all aspects of life in Brookline for all of our citizens. The Advisory Committee recommends favorable action by a vote of 21-03 on the motion as it has been amended.
Thank you, Mr. Franco.
Ben Franco for the unanimous Board of Selectmen. Ms. Allaire and Ms. Humphreys did a wonderful job walking town meeting members through the details of this motion, and as a result, there's not much for me to say. I will make 4 brief points, however. First, the Board of Selectmen does not expect any changes to the Commission on Disabilities operations to result from passage of Article 12. The Commission will remain a place in town government that disabled residents and visitors can go to have their concerns addressed and to find advocates willing to help them navigate Brookline town government. Second, the passage of Article 12 will clarify the Commission on Disabilities' role within town government. As you heard, today the Commission derives its powers from town meeting's acceptance in 1986 of Chapter 40, Section 8J of the Massachusetts General Laws, and that mention of the Commission doesn't exist in the town's bylaws today. Because the Commission's role, powers, and duties and membership guidelines are not found in the bylaws, there could be confusion about how the Commission is supposed to interact with town government, boards and commissions, and residents of the community. Passage of Article 12 will begin to answer these questions. Third, the Board of Selectmen commends the Commission for bringing the matter to town meeting's attention. Tonight's debate and the conversation that led up to it has brought attention to the Commission's existence and will cause those in need of its services and expertise to approach the Commission to avail themselves of those services. Raising attention to its existence and the work that it does is one of the reasons the Commission chose to file the warrant article, and clearly it has achieved its goal. Finally, the Board of Selectmen wishes to thank the Commission for its work on behalf of some of Brookline's most vulnerable citizens. Through the Commission's efforts, Brookline continues to be a more welcoming place, inclusive community, and accepting of all people. By a vote of 5-0, the Board of Selectmen urges a vote of favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Sainer.
Thank you, Ma'am. Good evening, Paul Sainer, Precinct 13 Town Meeting Member. I am not a proponent of this warrant article, but I was very pleased to be asked by the Commission on Disability to share my 3 personal perspectives on why I'm asking all of you to unanimously support this. First of all, professionally, I'm the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind. I report to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. There are 4 disability agencies within state government, and our charge through providing services is to maximize the productive independence of those that are disabled in the Commonwealth. That effort is significantly enhanced when there is strong municipal level support for people with disabilities. Secondly, I have been a member of the town's Economic Development Advisory Board for 20 plus years and have been its co-chair for the last 5 or 6 years. And I know that those that serve on boards and commissions take those responsibilities very seriously. I'm very pleased to learn of the resurgence of the Commission on Disability. I want to thank Selectman Franco and Ms. Allaire, and I want to also mention Myra Burloff, who had been the executive director of the Massachusetts Office on Disability, who I had the pleasure of working with in state government, who is one of the new members of the Brookline Commission on Disability. As you've already heard, the general bylaw effectively sets a charge for this commission, and we're sending a clear message to its members into the disability community. The town meeting is very supportive of Brookline being diverse in all respects. We hear a lot about our racial diversity and social economic. There are a number of people with disabilities living in this community. Thirdly, my perspective as a disabled person or a person with a disability. I would think that most people that are disabled would single out access as one of our key issues. I want to compliment the town administrator on the materials for this town meeting being more accessible than any of the previous town meetings that I've been a participant of. We've got some work to do, however, with the Brookline tab, whose website is not accessible to me. In closing, I would like to tell you that if this article is passed tonight, we'll be the 139th municipality in the Commonwealth to have in our general bylaws or ordinances the powers and duties that were referenced. I urge favorable support for Article 12. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll.
Hi, I'm Frank Carroll, Precinct 10. I'm speaking on behalf of the Brookline CAN's Livable Community Advocacy Committee, and I should say I'm also co-chair of Brookline's Age-Friendly City Program. What we're going to be doing this evening, as the other speakers have indicated, is that we are going to be, in effect, affirming the importance and significance of the Commission on Disability. We're going to be formalizing the roles and responsibilities of the making explicit what has been implicit. I do want to say also that that really what's happening with the Commission has some practical implications. Just as a kind of a seemingly small matter, but kind of written into this bylaw is the expectation that this Commission is going to meet regularly. It spells out that it's going to meet at least 10 times a year, and that means that the Commission is committed to being active. It puts itself in a position to really lay out an agenda for itself and to be proactive in pursuit of issues. It's also going to be available to residents when they have concerns that they want to bring to the Commission. So it's really, and I should say this is in contrast to the recent past where the commission has not been active. So this is really a welcome development. I particularly want to commend Sarah Lynn Allaire for her leadership in this respect. Sarah Lynn is a very active member of the Age Friendly City program. She is there representing the Commission on Disabilities. She and the Commission have a very active agenda, and they have quite a number of substantive matters that they're pursuing. So it's a highly welcome development. I also want to commend Selectman Franco for his work with the committee in helping them to reestablish themselves and move forward. So this is a significant event that we are about to vote favorable action on this article. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heist.
Can you lower it some? That's good. Great. My name is Rob Heist. I live in Precinct 9, and I am a member of the Brookline Board on Disability. Due to a paralyzing injury to my spinal cord in a water skiing accident right after college, I have been using a wheelchair to get around ever since. During this same period of time, public awareness of all persons with disabilities has gone from a very low awareness to a place where we are today, ever since the passage of the Americans for Disability Act in 1993. Because of this heightened awareness of disability issues in all aspects of society, it is appropriate that our existence as a Commission on Disability be formally recognized in the bylaws of the town of Brookline. It is important to mention that the individuals making up the majority of our commission membership either have a disability or have a family member with a disability. With our unique awareness and perspective, members of our commission feel very qualified to work with the DPW and other town partners to meet the needs of the most vulnerable people in our population who seek to live an active and vibrant life, both here in Brookline as residents or visiting our town from other localities. A good example of our unique perspective is access to buildings. Are there stairs at the front of the front entrance? Is the access door wide enough? Is there a ramp or an elevator to other floors? Are the bathrooms set up properly for use by a person using a wheelchair? Can someone with limited hand strength reach or use light systems, light switches, faucet handles, doorknobs, elevator switches, or fire alarm systems? Are tables high enough, doors wide enough, light switches low enough, bathroom stalls big enough, or sinks too low or too high? Yes, specifications have been written and are available for all of these issues, but our members have the added benefit of being able to actually test out needed modifications before they become subject to general use. Finally, because our commission has a very large and growing influence on all disability aspects that will benefit both the able-bodied and disabled persons who are represented, we urge all town meeting members to recognize this need and to vote favorably on this warrant article.
Thank you, Ms. Burloff.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. My name is Myra Burloff, and I live at 30 Longwood Avenue. I am a member of the Commission on Disability. And as Mr. Sanger mentioned, for 14 years I was the agency head at the Mass Office on Disability. In 1995, I was recruited by the Office on Disability to be the Assistant Director for Community Services. And in that position, my major responsibility was to work with local commissions throughout the Commonwealth. At that time, the Americans with Disabilities Act was 5 years old, and people in this country were just beginning to realize that people with disabilities deserve the same civil rights protections as were afforded to all of our citizens. Massachusetts has been one of the country's leaders in supporting disability rights, and one of the first states in the country that codified within our general laws the ability for a municipality to establish a local commission on disability, which was done in Mass General Laws, Chapter 40, Section 8J. Brookline adopted this in 1986, right at the beginning. And in order to assist municipalities in complying with the general law, and also in order to have some uniformity across the state so that the goals of the local commissions on disabilities were really pretty much the same, the Office on Disability created sample bylaws. These bylaws have been used by the vast majority of municipalities that have established commissions under Chapter 40, Section 8J. Those are the bylaws that were used, or the sample bylaws that were used for the warrant article today. So here we are today, 27 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. 31 years since the town of Brookline voted to have a commission on disability. I think it's time that Brookline Commission has the same status in town bylaws that all the other local commissions have. People with disabilities have fought long and hard to be recognized as valuable members of our community, as an integral part of our community. The Commission on Disability was established to be the voice of people with disabilities within the town and the conscience of town government, to ensure that all of our citizens, and in particular for this commission, our citizens with disabilities, have an equal opportunity to benefit from the programs and services that Brookline establishes. I am hoping that tonight we can all celebrate and that you vote to accept this warrant article. Thank you.
On the question, the proposed bylaw on the lavender supplement, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, raise your hands. That motion carries unanimously. We now turn to Article 20. The motion offered under Article 20 is found on the rose-colored supplement, pages 1 to 3, moved by Ms. Heller, seconded by Mr. Harris, that it's a resolution regarding the Paris Climate Agreement. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Harris, Precinct 8 and co-chair of Climate Action Brookline. My number one concern regarding climate change, having grown up in southern New England and lived in Brookline for 26 years now, I'm very worried about extreme heat events. I remember years when temperatures would break 90 degrees for a week or so every summer, but we now routinely see several 100-plus degree days each year. One day last week, in mid-May, the temperature reached 95 degrees in Brookline. How hot will it get this summer, and the next, and the next? This is one example, I believe, that climate change is affecting us right now in Brookline, and that the impacts will grow more extreme as each year goes by. Crazily, amidst all this, candidate Trump vowed last year that if he became president, he would tear up, quote, the Paris Climate Agreement. In response, a group at Climate Action Brookline realized, as many have, that if the federal government fails to show leadership, the work would have to be done at more local levels. So we've consulted with several dozen people in town to come up with a document that we think gives us a way to move forward. The Paris Climate Agreement was launched in 2015 as a model of diplomatic sensitivity designed to address problems created by the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, where rich versus developing countries squabbled over obligations, and then, when countries tried to roll back overly ambitious plans during the Great Recession, valuable resources were wasted in diplomatic and legal battles. The negotiators in Paris, working under the auspices of the United Nations, decided to try a different approach. They would create an aspirational and inclusive document, an instrument of moral suasion and not one of legal imperatives. They felt that as extreme heat events, forest fires, floods, island inundations, glaciers melting, changing habitat zones for plants and animals increase around the world, people will join voluntarily. Their success has been spectacular. 195 countries worldwide at all stages of political and economic development have signed the Paris Climate Agreement. It has essentially brought the entirety of humanity into common cause. The only two countries in the world that have not signed, Syria and Nicaragua, which together account for only 1/4% of global emissions. You can see what a diplomatic disaster it would be if Trump carries out his campaign promise. The USA, responsible for almost 18% of global emissions, would be turning its back on one of the major existential crises facing the world today. But even if he goes through it, the people of the United States are moving ahead without him. Warrant Article 20 asks Brookline to join 182 cities and towns in the USA and locally Boston, Cambridge, Medford, and Somerville in signing on to the non-state actor zone platform of the Paris Agreement. The negotiators in Paris created a two-tier structure. Nation states would sign in a manner similar to normal international treaties, although with minimal obligations. Their innovation, though, the creation of something called a non-state actor zone, which any group apart from nations can join, and which, curiously, is notable because it has no enforcement mechanisms whatsoever. Non-state actors are asked, not required, to submit an assessment of their progress and their goals in 2018, next year, and then every 5 years thereafter. No one will be grading. No one will even pester us if we don't get it done on time, but we should, because this is an unparalleled opportunity to see how we're doing against best practices worldwide and against goals we set ourselves. As our group took Warrant Article 20 through its paces, all the town bodies we spoke with felt Brookline should support the Paris Agreement, but shared a single major concern, that the periodic updates would place an undue burden on town staff already dealing with 40Bs, 9th and possibly 10th schools, etc. In response, several of us at Climate Action Brookline have committed to taking a leading role in the 2018 assessment. We hope to work closely with the Selectmen's Climate Action Committee, the Advisory Committee, the Board of Selectmen, town staff, the Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Public Transportation Advisory Committees, local environmental groups like the Brookline Green Space Alliance, Mothers Out Front, Hiking Brookline, and 350 Mass, civic groups like the Rotary Club and Chamber of Commerce, political action groups like Brookline PACs, Indivisible, the local Democratic, Republican, and Green parties, local church groups, and with anyone else who would like to contribute. I'm especially interested in the ideas of Brookline students, such as the members of the Brookline High School Environmental Club, and elementary school kids like those who exhibit at the science fair that's held each year during Climate Week. In conclusion, several years back, as we first learned about the science of climate change, many of us found ourselves depressed and paralyzed by the immensity and gravity of the challenges we face. But now we're beginning to realize that there are 1,000 local solutions that we can implement. At the heart of the Paris Climate Agreement, a belief that if we respect the science, if we think clearly and buckle down, we can level off and maybe even just begin to reverse the negative emissions trends that endanger us. We hope everyone in Brookline will join us and will contribute their best ideas and their best efforts to the exciting and urgent project of addressing climate change. I urge favorable action on Warrant Article 20.
Thank you, Ms. Heller.
Nancy Heller for a unanimous Board of Selectmen. At this time, when climate change deniers are in charge of federal efforts to halt the progress toward increasing use of renewable sources of energy. We must, at the local level, redouble our efforts to ensure that the use of fossil fuels declines and the use of renewable energy rises. That effort should include protection of the Paris Agreement. This resolution, and John has told you the background and the importance of it, I'm just going to focus on the resolve clauses. This resolution confirms our commitment to that goal by committing us to working towards adherence to the Paris Agreement of 2015, supporting the non-state zone platform of that agreement, as other U.S. cities and towns have done, filing Brookline's existing climate action plan on that non-state zone platform, revising and updating our climate action plan as soon as we can, and continuing to educate the citizens of Brookline about the dangers of climate change is so important, especially in this time when we have federal government that is willing to tear up that agreement. This resolution is all the more important because of the policies of not only the President, but the Congress as well, and federal agencies. Please join the unanimous Board of Selectmen in voting favorable action on the motion found on this pink supplement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Humphrey. And Mr. Pantalone, would you come forward, please? No, you're just sit in the front row. I'll call you.
Brookline's Selectmen's Climate Action Committee promotes a goal of 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, sharing ideas among all of the non-state actors that, in addition to the 198 countries that signed on to the Paris Agreement, may help us to develop strategies that will achieve the goal that we are working towards to have a near zero net emissions. The advisory committee recommends favorable action on the amended resolution with a 16-08 vote. And everything else that we were going to talk about, you already did.
Thank you. That's very sensible of you. Mr. Pantalone?
Good evening, Mr. Speaker and audience. Dave Pantalone, Precinct 7, and co-chair of Climate Action Brookline. I'm going to skip some of my prepared remarks. The previous speakers have already touched on some of that. I want to laud the leadership of the CAC, Climate Action Committee, over the years in driving and documenting progress on climate. And you should know that they do not have to stand alone in that effort. As a previous speaker mentioned, several members of the Climate Action Brookline and the Brookline community, those who have the passion, energy, and expertise in areas of science, engineering, economics, and climate, stand willing to offer additional leadership and support for their efforts. This collaborative effort is not merely an emergency response, it's symbolic of the whole climate crisis. Climate change is a community problem across the globe. It requires community action across the globe. That is the purpose of having an international participation by various entities in something like the Paris Climate Accord. By participating publicly, we acknowledge that we are in fact a social species, not a pack of isolated, uncoordinated, and mute entities. Public participation brings accountability and contributes positively to the intended effect. So I just want to conclude with a couple of metaphors. Metaphors, provide succinct imagery of reality and/or concepts. So when we're stressed with complexity, ignorance, decision-making, or crisis, we sometimes defer action, and we call it kicking the can down the road. Dwell on that image for a second of kicking the can of climate change down the road. When we kick the climate change down the road, we act as if we have some divine entitlement to survival. but we are really kicking a can with an IED in it. Yes, IED as in improvised explosive device. Combine that image with the fact that besides the climate effects that our previous speaker enumerated, we have huge gas bubbles of methane precariously stored underground in what was frozen tundra across the globe. Methane is even more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Every time we do anything which contributes to the rise of greenhouse gas and the rise of global temperature, we are giving another kick to those cans of methane and another jiggle to that suicide vest that we unwittingly all wear. The process of anthropomorphic climate change has been going on for a while now. It didn't just start yesterday. That can has already been kicked a number of times. Science has shown that those cans and that vest have a tipping point. The closer we get to the tipping point, the more it becomes a hairline trigger. I suggest that we do not kick that can and that we vote favorably for warrant Article 20.
Block that metaphor. Ms. Corcoran?
Hi, my name is Mary Corcoran. I live on Acres Avenue, and I'm a junior at Brookline High School. I'm here to represent Brookline High School legislature, a governing body made of students, teachers, and administrators, as well as student council, a governing body made of elected students. Both of these groups unanimously support the Paris Climate Agreement and endorse warrant Article 20. One of many reasons our school is concerned about climate change is because as global temperature increases, droughts will be more dramatic and more frequent. Both groups recommend favorable action on warrant Article 20. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vitek.
Hi, my name is Nadia Vitek, and I am a member of the Environmental Action Club at Brookline High School. Okay. Do you want me to repeat that? Okay.
A little closer to the mic.
So I'm a member of the Environmental Action Club at Brookline High School. The club fully supports the Paris Climate Agreement and endorses warrant Article 20 because of our concern for climate change and the effects that air pollution will have towards health, including an increase in risks for cancer, type 2 diabetes, and asthma. Brookline is especially at risk to this due to our proximity to Boston. We recommend favorable action on this warrant article. In addition, we would like to thank other groups that have endorsed warrant Article 20, including the Green Caucus of Town Meeting members, Brookline PACs, Brookline Community Aging Network, the Brookline team of Mothers Out Front, the Boston Node of 350 Mass, and the Spinoza Reading Group, on the grounds that Spinoza was the world's first ecological philosopher. Thank you.
Thank you. On the motion on the rose-colored supplement, those in favor, please raise your hands. Well, Mr. Fisher, if there are 35 members of town meeting who want a recorded vote on this clearly unanimous proposition, we'll have one. I don't see. There are not 35. On the motion, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? To the surprise of all, the motion carries unanimously. Article 23. Ms. Bermel, would you come forward? The motion offered under Article 23 is on the yellow supplement entitled Motion Offered by Tommy Vitolo. It's to amend, well, actually the full text of the motion starts with the first whereas clause. So the motion would be voted that the town adopt the following resolution, and then starting with the whereas, the ability, etc. It's moved by Mr. Vitolo, seconded by Mr. Richmond. The advisory committee motion, supported by the selectmen, moved by Mr. Doggett and seconded by Ms. Heller, would delete paragraph 2 of the Vitolo motion at the top of page 2 of the yellow supplement. I call on Lily Bermel.
Hello everyone, my name is Lily Bermel. I live on Middlesex Road and am a senior at Brookline High School. I've worked with some peers from the Brookline High School Environmental Action Club to submit this resolution. The resolution will fund infrastructure improvements for people walking, biking, and riding mass transit in Brookline. It calls for 2 distinct actions to be taken. First, it asks that Brookline show support at the state level for the passage of a bill entitled An Act Relevant to Regional Transportation Ballot Initiatives. This act gives Brookline the ability to create local option taxes to fund transportation upgrades. That tax can take a few different forms, like sales, property, payroll, or excise. It must be voted upon by the town citizens at the ballot before it can be implemented. The second part of this article resolves that once the act is passed by the state, Brookline implements any local option tax whose funds be used explicitly and solely for additional funding for pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit infrastructure inside the town. The ability to move on foot, bike, or with mass transit is an important value to the citizens of Brookline. According to the League of American Bicyclists, Massachusetts has seen more than 100% growth in the number of citizens who commute by bike. Walking remains a priority in the town, as evidenced by the efforts made by BCAN and frequent discussions about walkability with respect to the 9th elementary school site. The MBTA continues to set new ridership records. It is important to accommodate these growing numbers by installing comfortable and convenient infrastructure for people commuting on bikes or by foot, or enhancing the safety and accessibility of doing so. Examples of this infrastructure include sidewalk and crosswalk repairs for pedestrians, cycle tracks and bike racks for bikers, and traffic signal prioritization technology and benches or rain hoods for mass transit users. We recognize that Brookliners walk, bike, and use mass transit as a common method of transportation, and we want to make their lives better by enhancing the safety of doing so. Brookline as a town is committed to these upgrades, but is constrained by available revenue. In the past decade, Brookline Town Meeting has demonstrated a willingness to administer local option taxes through implementations of local option taxes both on restaurant meals and room occupancy. The idea behind this resolution is to make walking, biking, and using mass transit more safe, accessible, comfortable, and convenient. People will choose to transport via these methods more often, as doing so becomes more desirable with better infrastructure. Studies have shown that people who walk, bike, and use mass transit are healthier, less stressed, can save money, and are more likely to shop locally instead of driving far away to shop. Local businesses will only benefit from more people being outside and near their shops. Walking, biking, and using mass transit should be a safe and accessible option for residents of all ages and all abilities. This resolution is about making it easier and safer for senior citizens to move around and for their second-grade families to walk to school. This resolution is about enabling more people to transport, whether they be too young, too old, physically incapable, or unable to afford to drive. The revenue would provide the funding necessary to implement a long list of projects, thereby improving transportation comfort and residence for people of all ages and all abilities. I am in support of the second part of the resolution. The original resolution called for a 3-cent gas tax, but after talking with a number of folks, we want the town to take a step back and look at all of the possible revenue options, do more research, and then pick the best route to raise revenue. The gas tax is an option, but something better could go into place. So I support the Vitolo motion. It changes the resolution from asking that Brookline support a 3-cent gas tax to asking that Brookline implement any local option tax that abides under the state law. Naturally, we expect that upon passage, the Selectmen will look at all options to raise revenue for pedestrians. By voting no on the advisory committee amendment, the resolution will include all options for implementation of a local option tax. In conclusion, there is a transportation funding problem that is yet to be addressed. There are a backlog of specific projects already identified but currently unfunded, including the Complete Streets policy requirement and other opportunities to enhance transportation infrastructure to make it more safe, accessible, comfortable, and convenient. What I am proposing to you tonight is the solution, an opportunity to generate additional revenue to specifically support people walking, people on bikes, and people using the T. All Brookline residents rely on our transportation network, and all transportation users benefit from sidewalks and streets with safer infrastructure. I'm grateful to have the endorsement of Brookline Community Aging Network, Climate Action Brookline, Green Caucus, Brookline PACS, and 350 Mass. I urge you to vote no on the amendment and yes on the main motion. Thank you.
Ms. Brumell sets a fine example. That was 5 minutes and 2 seconds. Mr. Doggett?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, everybody. John Doggett, Precinct 13, and for the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee in general felt that a local tax surcharge option for transportation projects, such as in S1551, going through the legislature, would be beneficial to the town. It provides greater local control over revenue, as well as providing extra funding for much-needed transportation projects. Since the Act has not yet passed, and there may be additional changes to the language in the Act's content, the committee felt it was premature to go further than supporting the passage of the Act. The AC motion, which is now an amendment to the main motion, supports the passage of this S1551 Act, but does not recommend or suggest any specific sources or uses of those revenues. Now let me turn to the Vitolo amendment, which is now part of the main motion. I guess it's complicated, which calls for the town meeting to support use of revenues generated from implementation of the Act to fund pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit improvements only. The Vitolo amendment calls for a narrow interpretation of transportation projects allowed for in the Act and calls for the town meeting to support only pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit projects rather than all transportation-related projects allowed for in the Act. The committee believes that if the town wants to consider this option, a local tax surcharge, and should become available by the passage of the Act in the legislature, then much more work and discussion is needed to be done. For example, to ascertain the revenues amounts to be raised, the transportation projects which to support, the examination of the tax surcharge or combination of tax surcharges which should be used. The committee believes that this second resolve will short-circuit the discussion is premature. On the other hand, other members felt that making wishes known at this time does not preclude that or preempt that discussion. The advisory committee, by a vote of 8 to 12 to 4, recommended not to incorporate the Vitolo amendment, and on a vote of 18 to 3 against and 5 abstentions, recommends favorable action for town meeting to support the passage of S1551, the advisory committee's amendment motion. Thank you.
Mr. Audi?
Thank you. My name is Elias Audi, owner of the 2 mobile gas stations in Brookline, and I'm here to voice an opposition on the Warren article intent of funding, which is the gas tax proposal. The proposal funding, in my opinion, is discriminatory towards one class of business, as it targets only the very few operating gas stations in Brookline. There are only 8 gas stations left in Brookline, and only less than half of those are really good businesses. The rest are very small and not profitable. They're about to just disappear. The claim also that gas stations are easy businesses for generating gas, cash, and easy to compute for the proposed tax. It's not true. Gas stations are not a good source of cash anymore. They're not a great source of a lot of income anymore. Gas usually, if there is no busy repair shop, gas is subsidized heavily by repair shops. So if you take a gas station and you establish the profits, gross profits from the gas in the store, there is not one single gas station can survive unless there is a very active and very busy repair shop. In the last 15 years, we noticed that over half the number of gas stations in Brookline have closed down. In the next 10 to 15 years, I predict, and almost the whole industry predicts, that lots of those are going to close down, and we're lucky to have maybe one left in Brookline. And so for this reason and many, many more, I am against the proposal of funding the gas stations by gas tax, and thank you. And I really urge you to vote no on this issue, this specific issue, funding with gas tax. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Heller and Mr. Vitolo, please come forward.
Nancy Heller for the Board of Selectmen. Should we support passage of a Mass Senate bill to allow towns to raise additional local revenue for transportation projects? The Board of Selectmen unanimously believes that we should encourage the passage of this bill. And if it becomes law, we could ask the voters then whether to agree to local option taxes to support transportation initiatives. First, I want to commend Petitioner Lily Bermel and her BHS peers who have brought this issue to our attention. It is very heartening to see young people engaged in the political process and see their desire and passion to improve their community where they and their families live. Let me turn to the Vitolo motion. The Board of Selectmen considered that tonight at our meeting, before town meeting. And we decided not to reconsider the advisory committee's motion. In other words, we decided to support the advisory committee motion. We do that because we believe that if and when this act, which is now just an act, it's not a law, it hasn't been passed by the Senate, and we don't know if it ever will. Which is the subject of this warrant article. It could take years, in fact, to occur, if it does occur. We can assess Brookline's needs at that time and ask the voters to approve the local, we're going to have to go to the voters anyway, so we can ask them to approve a local action tax for any or all a part of the pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transportation infrastructure, or any other items which the act may cover at the time of its passage. We don't want to constrict ourselves. We do not want in any way to prescribe what a future town meeting may do when we don't have a specific statute to consider. So please vote no action on Tommy Vitolo's motion and favorable action on the advisory committee motion. The Board of Selectmen voted this by 3-2. Thank you.
Well, to be a little more technically correct, Ms. Heller is urging you to vote in favor of the advisory committee and selectmen amendment of the main Vitolo motion, the amendment which would delete the second paragraph. Mr. Vitolo?
Tommy Vitolo, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. Warrant Article 23, as initially filed, called for three things. One, that town meeting express support for a state bill that allows for local option transportation, specifically with revenue, to be spent on local transportation. Two, if that state bill passes, that Brookline impose a 3-cent local options gas tax. And three, Brookline apply that incremental revenue to improving pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transportation infrastructure in Brookline. And I liked all three of those items. Well, I did until I went to the advisory committee subcommittee hearing. I was persuaded at that hearing that a 3-cent local options gas tax might be perfect. But maybe a 2-cent or a 4-cent tax would be better. Or maybe a surcharge on motor vehicle excise tax would be better. Or maybe something else would be better. The AC subcommittee's probing questions convinced me that the 3 specific items in the initial resolution, of them number 2, should not be specific to a 3-cent local options gas tax. That argument also convinced the petitioner and 100% of the advisory committee subcommittee. And so the AC subcommittee voted 3-0 on language that, 1, called for town meeting to express support for a state bill that would allow a local options tax with revenue to be spent on transportation, and 3, for Brookline to apply that incremental revenue to improving pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit infrastructure in Brookline. But the language the AC subcommittee proposed didn't pass muster with the moderator, and so it was dropped. Ultimately, the advisory committee chose to preserve only the first of the 3 items. 1, town meeting expressed support for a state bill that allows for local option taxes with revenue to be spent on local transportation. And that is the advisory committee's amendment, just that. Most town meeting members know that the third part of the resolution, as filed, is something I support. I believe the town should spend more money improving our sidewalks and crosswalks and curb ramps. We should install better bike infrastructure. We should press forward with transit signal prioritization for the C line, and we should work to put more benches and shelters at bus stops. And so the Vitolo motion was born and printed on a goldenrod colored supplement. Let's get part 3 back into this resolution as the petitioner intended and as supported by the Advisory Committee Subcommittee, Brookline PACs, the Green Caucus, and the Brookline Community Aging Network. The Vitolo motion, which has become the main motion, calls for 1, town meeting to express support for a state bill that allows for taxes to be applied to local transportation, and 3, that Brookline apply any incremental revenue made possible by that state bill to improving pedestrian, bicycle, and mass transit infrastructure in Brookline. Now, this is a non-binding resolution. It's an expression made by this town meeting. We're not carving into tablets of stone here. And so if you, like the unanimous AC subcommittee, nearly 1/2 of the advisory committee and nearly 1/2 of the Board of Selectmen, the petitioner, myself, PACs, the Green Caucus, and BCAN think that we should invest more money on improving the safety and convenience of our budgetarily marginalized, non-motorized, and mass transit infrastructure as described in this resolution. And if you are grateful, as I am, that the petitioner has identified a new funding source to pay for it, well, then I ask you to think about this. We just voted unanimously to support the Commission of the Disabled. And we just voted unanimously to support the Paris Agreement. Let's put our money where our mouths are. Let's vote no on the advisory committee amendment, and then yes on the main motion, the Goldenrod Vitolo motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vitek and Ms. Corcoran.
Hi, my name is Mary Corcoran. I live on Acres Avenue. I'm a junior at Brookline High School, and I'm here to represent the Brookline High School Legislature and Student Council, both of whom fully support warrant Article 23 and encourage you to vote favorably on the Vitolo motion. Brookline High School students and staff, most of whom walk, bike, and take mass transit to school, rely on Brookline transportation infrastructure in their daily lives. Making this infrastructure safer would promote all Brookline residents and those traveling through Brookline to be proactive in implementing the change they want in their communities by adopting a lifestyle that is conducive to the preservation of our planet. For this reason, Brookline High School Legislature and Student Council both recommend favorable action on the Vitolo motion.
Hi, my name is Nadia Vitek, and I live on Westbourne Terrace. I am a junior at Brookline High School, and I am a member of the Brookline High School Environmental Action Club. The club unanimously supports this warrant article because we believe that having safe biking infrastructure in Brookline is an urgent and important issue. Personally, biking is very important to me. I'm looking forward to biking once I recover from my ACL injury, but I also want to ensure that the risk of being injured is low. Like me, many are also worried about the conditions of roads for biking. Parents are afraid to let their children bike due to narrow roads, lack of bike lanes, and reckless driving. Dedicating more revenue to biking infrastructure will encourage youth to bike, make it less stressful for concerned parents, and most importantly, reduce the likelihood of collisions between motor vehicles and bikers. So I am here to represent the Brookline High School Environmental Action Club, who is unanimously in favor of Warrant Article 23 and recommends favorable action on the Vitolo motion due to the reasons previously stated and more. Thank you.
Let me just add that it's very gratifying to me personally to have our students at Brookline High School participating in the civic process to the extent that they are, especially this year. There's not a great deal of opportunity within the high school to learn about how municipalities work, and these students are really to be commended for the part that they're playing. Mr. Rosen? Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes, thank you. Marty Rosenthal, Brookline High, class of 64. And
a fogey.
Oh, I'm trying to identify myself. Also Precinct 9 and co-chair of PACS. We support the Vitolo motion, and I noticed something as I'm looking at it more carefully tonight than I have before. I have the misfortune of dealing with a lot of legislative issues in criminal justice, and I'm well aware that bill numbers constantly change and legislative titles constantly change. And I wonder if it might be a worthy friendly amendment to offer 4 words if the moderator would let me speak them. It would be after, I take that as I may continue.
I haven't said no yet.
All right. After the quotation mark transportation ballot initiatives, I'd suggest the following: either or a derivative bill or else or a similar bill. I realize this is a non-binding resolution, but to the extent anybody looks at it later, it seems to me that that number could even change in the next month or two.
All right. What's your language?
After the quotation marks with the name of the act, which follows the Senate 1551, I'm suggesting not in quotation marks, either or a derivative bill or else or a similar bill.
How about similar?
I'd certainly go with the moderator's wisdom on everything.
Well, I'll accept that amendment. We don't have to vote on it as long as the moving party is in favor. Mr. Vitolo? Okay. And Mr. Clafter?
David Clafter, town meeting member, Precinct 12, and also speaking as a member of 350 Massachusetts, Boston Node. We've had the pleasure of working with 3 of the students from the high school in the past year from the environmental club and as also the social justice program. We've been extremely impressed with their dedication and not just the desire to be involved, but to come up with proposals and solutions that the rest of us have failed to come up with. I think this whole resolution was very timely, well conceived, and I think while the specifics of the gas tax may or may not be the best way to go, that the intent to raise additional revenue, not to close the budget gap, not to substitute so that some other program could be paid for, but specifically so that we could raise money to address the issues of transportation and to take a real step towards moving away from the internal combustion engine as the major source of transportation. That is the clear intent of this, and the town meeting should endorse that by supporting this, the Vitolo motion, which I believe technically would mean voting no on the advisory committee amendment, if I'm correct in that.
You are?
So I think that the argument that the bill hasn't yet been passed is something of a red herring, in that this is a resolution. This is not a piece of legislation. This is trying to make very clear the intent of town meeting to both pass the bill that would authorize local initiatives like this, and for us to take advantage of that bill to pass a local initiative, a local tax, to put that before the citizenry in order to supplement the money being spent on our transportation systems, pedestrian, biking, mass transit, etc. So I urge people to support the Vitolo motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll.
Joel Feingold, Precinct 1.
I called Mr. Carroll.
I'm sorry.
You'll be next, Mr. Feingold.
I apologize.
No need to apologize. Happens to all of us.
Hi, I'm Frank Carroll, Precinct 10, speaking again on behalf of the Brookline Can Livable Community Advocacy Committee. What I want to focus on is pedestrian needs. Brookline Can has been focusing on emphasizing Brookline's walkability. We look at walking as an important form of transportation. It's also good for good physical activity. It promotes health. I want to emphasize the fact we could use the money. I mean, there's some projects that we could really benefit from if we had additional revenue to support pedestrians. Last night, we heard from Kia Vandenberg, who asked about sidewalks in South Brookline. I mean, we have some streets without sidewalks. People who want to walk can't walk safely because we don't have sidewalks everywhere. Also, another of the needs that we've identified is the need for streetlights that do a better job in supporting pedestrians. We basically have a streetlight system that supports motorists. We have widely spaced poles that are very high. They cast a long light. Not the best thing for pedestrians. We have some instances in town where we have some excellent streetlights that support pedestrians. You can look at Harvard Street. I mean, it's really exemplary, but it's very limited, and it would be very expensive to do this on a more widespread basis. And without additional revenue, that's something we can't do. We have another problem, widespread problem with tree pits. We value our street trees, but we have very narrow right of ways. The street trees are competing with pedestrians for space. We deal with that by making cutouts in sidewalks to accommodate trees. We've got tree pits that are hazardous for pedestrians. There is a solution. It's pervious pavement, been demonstrated around Coolidge Corner, but it's expensive. And it needs to be done on a more widespread basis. We need the revenue. So I would just ask you for favorable support for the main motion here. We need the revenues to support sidewalks, and I'm sure the same can be said for projects to support public transportation and bicycle improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feingold.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So I find myself in a...
Who are you?
Yeah, sorry, Joel Feingold, Precinct 1. I find myself in a very strange position here because I'm very active in the pedestrian and bicycle safety communities, and all of the reasons for getting more money for transportation infrastructure which protects vulnerable users is very, very important. It's dear to my heart. I lost a friend who got wiped out from behind by a car on a road which didn't have a bike lane protected. Last year, I think we had over 70 people killed, pedestrians killed in Massachusetts by motor vehicles. So I'm very sensitive to these issues. But I think that there are good reasons to vote against this, which are larger issues. And so I'd like to just to present you to something to think about. That said, if you decide to favor this article, please favor it with Mr. Vitolo's paragraph 2, focusing the use of the money towards pedestrian and bicycle safety infrastructure. The reason that I'm speaking against this article is because this is what I would call a sneak attack by our legislature. What they're doing, yet again, and this is the state legislature, I say this with great respect to Senator Cream and Representative Moran, but our state legislature is once again not doing its job.
And Representative Smizek, of course.
Oh, thank you very much. I corrected, appreciate that. They're just not doing their job to raise the funds for the sort of infrastructure which needs to be funded at a state level, because it's not just one community, it's all communities. Right now, I think the Massachusetts gas tax is at 24 cents total, which includes federal and state and surcharges. And over 20 years ago, it was at 19 cents. Mileage on cars is approximately doubled. So the value, and there's been inflation, so the value of that is way down. What we get from it's way down. And we have hybrid and electric cars. So the correct way to do this is to charge a tax based upon how far the car is driven, a pay-as-you-mile, a pay-as-you-drive charge per mile, like we're starting to do with trash collection in Brookline. That's the way we have to go. All that said, the legislature can't do it, and by saying yes to this because we need the money, we enable them to continue to avoid doing their job. So that's number one. Number two, transportation does not stop at our town borders. The amount of coordination that needs to happen is very important, and so when you look at this and say, okay, we'll get some crosswalks, we'll get some raised crosswalks, we'll get a couple of bike lanes, this and that, that doesn't really do enough, because you need continuity in places in order to make transportation by bicycle work properly. Last, let me just talk for a moment about item 2 in the Vitolo version. It doesn't specifically say not to use the gas tax. I wish it did. The gas tax is regressive in its impact. I've already mentioned about the diminishing mileage and the electrical cars, electrified vehicles, and I think that we should be very sensitive to the fact that gas stations are going out of business. It's highly competitive. It's not 3 cents per gallon. It's 3 cents times a 20-gallon fill-up, once or twice a week for people who are commuting, and we all know how drivers shop around. So I suggest that if we come back around to this, that we avoid it. So again, in conclusion, I'd recommend voting against, but if you vote for, please vote for the Vitolo version. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond.
Good evening. Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. I'm speaking on behalf of the Green Caucus, of which I'm the co-chair, which endorses Article 23. It is fitting that it follows Warrant Article 21, since it addresses climate change, in this case, as a small incentive and reminder to reduce consumption of gasoline. But the main motion also seeks balanced transportation. Given local, state, and federal budget constraints, we need more local sources of revenue to address growth and demand for personal transportation other than by automobile. However, this resolution could also benefit vehicular traffic by making safety improvements, such as, for example, separating the various modes. I'm pleased that one of Brookline's state representatives Frank Smizek is a co-sponsor of House Bill H1640, which is parallel to the cited S1551. And I commend Mr. Rosenthal for pointing out that bills change during the legislative process and assisting with the language there. So, even if these bills are not passed, this resolution puts us on record as requesting greater priority for transportation alternatives. Please vote favorable action on the main motion.
Thank you. On the amendment of the Advisory Committee and Selectmen, Mr. Vitolo.
You know I'd love a recorded vote on this, wouldn't you? Tommy Vitolo, Tommy.
On the amendment, is that
On the
correct?
amendment, yes, sir.
Okay. There are 35 town meeting members who would want to, yes, there are. Okay, what we're voting on is the amendment proposed by the Advisory Committee and the Selectmen, which would simply delete paragraph 2 of the Vitolo motion on the yellow sheet. So this is Article 23 amendment. Just to review the process, press 1 if you're in favor of the amendment deleting paragraph 2. Press 2 if you're against that amendment, and 3 if you're abstaining. Okay, you can vote at any time in the next 40 seconds. You can vote often. The last time you vote is the one that is recorded. That motion fails by a vote of 43 in favor, 157 against, and 6 abstentions. On the main motion, which now includes both paragraph 1 as amended by Mr. Rosenthal's language, which is or a similar bill, right after the closed quotes in the second line of paragraph 1. Those
Have a recorded vote.
is all those who want a recorded vote? Yes, we'll have a recorded vote. This is main motion, Article 23, main motion. You are voting on the full motion on the yellow sheet, including paragraphs 1 and 2. Motion carries by a vote of 174 in favor, 26 against, and 11 abstentions. We move now to Article 10. The main motion under Article 10 is found on the yellow supplement, page 1, moved by Ms. Hamilton, seconded by Mr. Wyszynski, to amend a provision of the bylaws relating to publication of the warrant. There is a motion offered by Mr. Spiegel, seconded by Ms. Jonas, to refer the subject matter of this article to a selectmen's committee to report at the fall town meeting. The next town, well, it says next town meeting, maybe before the fall town meeting. When we vote, we will vote on the motion to refer first. If that fails, we will vote on the main motion. If it succeeds, the matter will be referred. Ms. Hamilton?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Heather Hamilton for a unanimous Board of Selectmen. Since the dawn of time, or at least as long as there's been a town meeting in Brookline, the town is required to make the upcoming town meeting warrant publicly available. The town currently does this by posting the warrant and supplements on the town website, mailing them to the moderator and town meeting members, posting on a minimum of 10 public bulletin boards, although I understand I have it on good authority from a constable that he tries to post them on 16 bulletin boards, one in each precinct, as well as publishing in a paper of general circulation, i.e. the tab. Last year, we spent over $6,000 on the publishing of the warrant, just for the fall. It took up approximately 7 pages and is incredibly difficult to read in the size of fine print of a warranty. If you have not seen it, I have an example right here. When you need a magnifying glass to read the document, is it really accessible? I would argue no. In an effort to save money and to acknowledge that times have changed, the Board of Selectmen would like to post the index of the articles in the warrant instead of in its entirety. We will also post the web address for those that want to read the entire document right underneath the index. We feel that this is a more efficient use of our resources, both money and staff time, and is the primary means of communication for most folks who look for information. For those that do not have computer access, there are 3 libraries. Shout out to the libraries. The warrant will still be posted on the bulletin boards and made available upon request. This will have the added benefit of ensuring that the information on the website is up to date and accurate as supplementals continually come through. The warrant must be published 15 days prior to annual town meeting. As we all know, a lot can happen in 2 weeks. Also to note, one important difference between the selectmen's motion and the advisory's motion is the word prominently. In the advisory's motion, they instruct the index to be published prominently in the newspaper of general circulation within the town. The board struck the word prominently from the advisory committee motion because we felt it was too vague and was open to a variety of interpretations. This board understands the desire for transparency and accessibility of information related to the warrant and index, and we feel that we will be able to accomplish this goal under our current motion. Lastly, there is a motion to refer the article. I applaud Mr. Spiegel's intention, but the matter is straightforward and we have the opportunity to act now, so I urge you to do so. The selectmen recommend favorable action on the selectmen's motion. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Spiegel, and before Mr. Spiegel starts, there's one correction in the vote on the main motion under Article 23. The tally, as it stands, is 175 in favor instead of 174, 26 against, and 11 abstentions. Mr. Spiegel.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Stanley Spiegel from Precinct 2, member of the Advisory Committee, and also a board member of Brookline PAX. PAX has taken the position to oppose this article, to oppose Article 10. But my position, which would support no action if referral fails, is in fact to provide an opportunity to get things right, which I believe warrant Article 10 does exactly the opposite to what we've been talking about and others have been talking about ever since the election and before. And that Chairman Wyszynski mentioned prominently in his opening remarks when he dealt with the budget, and that is to promote citizen involvement and get higher vote turnout at the polls. The most important thing that we do twice a year is contained in our warrant. And to correct Ms. Hamilton, who just spoke, the warrant does not change. once the warrant is signed and posted, the warrant stays as it is. There's no changing to the warrant as time goes on. Motions come and go, not the warrant. And the importance of getting the warrant out early and in legible form, and I grant you, legible form is important, is so that people will know what's coming, what meeting should they go to attend, what should they oppose, what should they favor, what changes should they try to make, who should they vote for town meeting based on positions that are on the warrant, and maybe they should run themselves. Letting people know what's coming is key. Now, it's been said, properly so, that as published in the legal notices section of the paper, the warrant is not legible. So the solution is don't publish it? I say no. The solution is to make it legible. And that's what we should be doing, because if we really care about citizen involvement and about getting more people up to speed as to what's going on, the thing to do is to find out what can be done to publish the warrant at an early point and in legible format and at affordable cost. And I would submit to you that that's exactly the homework that was not done when this warrant article was filed and as it's gone through the process. I made a call just yesterday, because this was not my subcommittee. I wasn't even thinking about this, to be honest with you, until yesterday I called the League of Women Voters insert, which is quite legible and quite sizable and easy to read, and people take it with them all the time, even those who like to use their computers and their laptops to get information. This costs $1,650 for a 24-page League of Women Voters guide. Since this is about 3 pages of 8.5 by 11 could fit into one of these pages, that's the equivalent of a 72-page warrant. Most warrants are significantly less than 72 pages, 8.5 by 11. And even the monster one we had last fall, would be require only about twice as many pages. So the price would be like $3,000 instead of $1,650. Now let me tell you, this is a bargain. For a regular size warrant, which we generally have, it comes out to about a nickel a voter for us to let voters know what's coming. And even for the large one, and that was a large one, it's about 3 times as much, certainly under 20 cents. Under 20 cents per voter, per warrant, for the biggest warrant anybody's ever seen, to let the voters of this town know what's coming and maybe get more involved, maybe find out what's going on, maybe decide to run for office, or at least come and revise and make motions and see what's happening and what to support and what to oppose. And I think that comes under the heading of good government. And I think that's what we keep saying we want. And it ain't too expensive, and it ain't prohibitive, and the amount of staff time, if you get this in Microsoft Word, I'm no expert in desktop publishing, but I've been reliably told that you get it in Microsoft Word and it can lay things out in appropriate columns, and there's minimal need for any proofreading. You just have to get it right and then submit it electronically, and the tab knows darn well how to file it. Unprinted. I called earlier today, and people in the administration office came back with a number which seemed awfully large. It turned out they were getting the number for 8.5 by 11 sheets. That isn't what I'm after. This is not 8.5 by 11. As I say, each of these sheets is 3 times as big, and the price is therefore 3 times as small as the number that the town hall staff got from me today. The main thing is there are unanswered questions. The unanswered questions are, A, could we qualify for the lesser rate? The tab charges a lot for legal notices. B, to qualify for that, would we have to take it out of the bylaws, so it would not be a legal requirement? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what the cost would be for a typical warrant. That's the sort of stuff that I say the Board of Selectmen should very well have explored before bringing this to town meeting.
30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The idea of disposing of the warrant without seeking alternatives, recognizing its importance, and indeed, if a lot of people find out information through their laptops and their smartphones, a lot don't. And if there are some houses which don't get the tab, there are many that do. Publishing this in the tab has to be a plus. It can be done economically, from what I've been able to find out, and at a minimum, this referral motion says explore it. comes back with information. It's a selectmen's committee, after all, that I'm referring you to, or like to. They are in control. They can do the fact-finding. And when we come back in September for the next special town meeting, which we're told is going to happen, that's the time we can make this decision with the sort of facts that have yet to be generated and should have been before this article ever saw the light of day. Thank you so very much.
Ms. Jonas? Ms. Khan?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Janice Khan, Precinct 15, Town Meeting Member, speaking for the Advisory Committee. Warrant Article 10, if passed, would eliminate the requirement in Article 2.1, Section 2.1.5 of the town's general bylaws to publish the articles of the warrant in their entirety in a newspaper of general circulation within the town. Instead, the town would be required to publish only the index. As you've heard, Warrant Article 10 was filed by the Selectmen in response to concerns about the amount of time and related costs involved in publishing last fall's warrant, which was 135 pages long, due to the many zoning articles in that warrant. So when it was published in the tab, it ran 7 pages in the legal notices section, which, as has been said, is in tiny, tiny print. And it cost the town exactly $6,396. A more typical cost for publishing in the tab is $1,000 to $2,000. So it's clearly not the typical amount that the town pays to have it published. So the process itself involves sending the warrant to the tab in a Word document, which is then prepared for publication, returned to the town, where staff need to then proofread the draft document, which is now in tiny print. So they proof it in very tiny print, which is one of the issues, taking significant staff hours. So the petitioners claim this will be cheaper because it'll be less expensive to print and also less expensive in terms of staff time. And while the effort involved is an important consideration, most of the advisory committee's deliberations focused on the larger issue, which Stanley Spiegel mentioned, of increasing public awareness and civic involvement. So the reason for publishing the warrant is literally to warn residents of the town what issues will be discussed and voted on that may have an impact on their lives. On the one hand, publishing the warrant in its entirety enables those people who do not use the internet, as Stanley said, to more easily access that information. And but on the other hand, and so they don't have to actively search for the warrant if it's delivered to them, which it is in most cases. On the other hand, because the warrant is published in the legal notices in very, very tiny print in the very back of the newspaper, without any indication that this warrant is actually published in that issue of the tab, it's unlikely that many people will take the effort to plow through the warrant in that format. Members of the advisory committee recognize that the requirement to publish only the index in and of itself would do little to achieve the goal of greater public knowledge and participation, especially if it's in that tiny print in the legal sections. And the summaries in the index do not often offer information on the substance of the articles, which is particularly true with zoning articles. The advisory committee proposed adding a word to warrant Article 10 to require that the index be placed in a prominent location. And prominent appears 3 times in our general bylaws already. It's a prominent word to use that the selectmen have even used in constructing our own bylaws. So, and with also electronic, with also the links or the way that people can access the warrant electronically, acknowledging that many of the residents now use computers and other electronic devices. But even with these modifications, members of the advisory committee remain divided as to whether or not these modifications would be adequate. Importantly, we recognize, while we considered various alternatives to expand upon the information to be published, all of the amendments would have gone beyond the scope of the current article. Town meeting member Stanley Spiegel has offered a motion to refer the subject of this warrant article.
You have 1 minute.
Fine. Back to the selectmen to evaluate alternative options for publishing the full warrant, such as the insert Stanley showed you of the one that the League of Women Voters of Brookline does publish in the tab. Deputy Town Administrator Melissa Goff informed the AC that she would have no objections to publishing the warrant in an alternative fashion if it was less costly and less time-consuming. And the cost also obviously depends on how long the warrant is. In order to pursue an option that might improve both upon the status quo and the current version of this warrant article, the Advisory Committee recommends favorable action by a vote of 15 in favor and 11 opposed with 1 abstention on the motion to refer. Thank you.
Ms. Frawley?
Regina Frawley, Precinct 16. I feel like this is a Michael Corleone moment for me. I didn't want any role in this town meeting, and I'm dragged back in just like The Godfather. Because this is what I care most about. I care about public process, and I've watched it erode. It's hard to beat anything, Stanley Spiegel says, but let me add one more thing, Stanley, that nobody even thought to negotiate with the tab for a lower fee. Why that matters is newspapers need advertising, and historically it has been the licenses, the liquor licenses, et cetera, the probate court notices, certain legalities that must be published according to state law, and one of the other cash cows is our warrant. So it's negotiable, and we've never even tried, and that's what a committee could explore as one of the possibilities. Take a look at the federal government right now. I don't think I need to tell anybody how transparency and accountability is eroding at the federal level when it comes to the media. So you know less than you've ever done under this administration. Take a look at the state. In 2010, as you learned in November, the state redefined public bodies such that there are committees now that are not considered public bodies. That means they don't have to do anything according to the law. You had a feel-good kind of motion in November, a substitute to say, okay, we'll try to do it. We'll follow it in spirit. There's no teeth in that. You didn't have any teeth in November. We have several good government articles that have no teeth. They wouldn't have passed. I know, I wrote several of them. And I find that in the last couple of years, they're being honored in the breach. So they're not televising the Board of Selectmen when they open. They just did for the first time in the classroom because I filed a complaint about it, that there's a bylaw. Marty Rosenthal's wonderful bylaw about the web. It has frequently published on our line and not on the web that his article requires for meetings of public bodies. I could go on, but what it comes down to is if we eliminate this, we'll be saying we respect liquor notices, probate notices, Vittler's notices more than we respect whether the rank and file residents of the town, all ages, not just citizens, who have a vested interest in the business of representative town government. That's all we are. So many people in town meeting think they're officials. You are not. You are called elected voters. You are exactly like your neighbors, and just to keep order, that's why we have representative town meeting. So you're as no more important nor less. So a couple of more points. I think that pretty much summarizes that we are becoming dimmer and darker in transparency. And while I want to defeat this non-researched, in my opinion, ill-advised savings of $6,000, if you don't just vote this down, I'm completely supporting the substitute measure that Stanley proposes. And Heather, bless your heart, I never go anywhere without carrying my own magnifying glass.
1 minute, Ms. Frawley.
And I use it every day for even reading olive oil bottles to make sure the olives are from Italy. Thank you.
Mr. Selwyn.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Lee Selwyn, town meeting member from Precinct 13. I'm also a member of the Planning and Regulation Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee, which deals with zoning issues. There's a specific requirement with respect to zoning warrant articles that relates to publication, and I was wondering if, let me describe it, and I was hoping that one of the proponents of this article could respond to see whether or not my concern is adequately addressed. Zoning articles are retroactive to the date of publication. So if there is a change in the zoning bylaw that is ultimately adopted by town meeting, the effective date of the change is the date of publication. And publication, as I understand it, is deemed to be publication in the newspaper of general circulation. So if, for example, there is a zoning article that's going to appear in the November town meeting, if it is published, let's say, on September 15th, that the effective date of that bylaw change, if it is adopted by town meeting, would date back to September 15th. If the warrant is not to be published in a newspaper of general circulation, that creates a potential problem with respect to zoning changes. Now, there are solutions to this. For example, we could change the requirement that simply posting it on the town website would constitute publication, but that is not the present situation. I think one of the reasons to support referral is so that there can be coordination between the general objective that the selectmen have suggested and some specific requirements such as the one that I am mentioning. But I'm wondering if this has been considered and how it would be addressed under the selectmen's motion.
Well, Town Council, do you have a view about this? Whether publication of just the description in the index is adequate to comply with the zoning notice requirements?
I'm not Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council, proud resident of Precinct 16 and a 1975 graduate of Brookline High School. I'm not immediately, I don't have the zoning bylaw with me. I'm not immediately familiar with that.
I think it's a matter of state law, is it not?
Well, under state law, Mr. Moderator, notice is sufficient once it is filed with the town clerk and posted on the town's prominent bulletin board at least 14 days before town meeting.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Moderator, with all due respect, when some of the zoning bylaw changes that were being considered, particularly Article 22 last November, I inquired about this and was advised that the date would be effective publication in the tab. Maybe that information was incorrect, but that's what I was told at the time by the building department.
I think you may be referring to a provision in the zoning bylaw. I'm not certain of that. Perhaps Ms. Steinfeld has a copy with her.
Mr. Spiegel?
Stanley Spiegel, Precinct 2. The publication of zoning articles, that's handled by the planning board. It has to be done 30 days in advance. There are various rules about that. That's independent of the publication of the warrant. Zoning articles themselves have their own statutory requirements for publication. That takes place independently of whenever the warrant gets published. There are two different things. One does not interfere with the other. At least that's my understanding.
Well, that's right. You may be right, but I think that what my understanding is that it was being interpreted as the first publication, and that may well have been when the entire warrant was published rather than the 30-day rule. And it's important that a zoning bylaw change be published as soon as possible so as to prevent gaming. Obviously, people could find out about the zoning bylaw change immediately upon the closing of the warrant and can then use that as an opportunity to sneak in effect, and get a project approved under the pre-existing rule that is about to be changed. So it's important that it be published quickly, and to whatever extent this warrant article might interfere with that, I would certainly hope that it could be referred and this could be examined and resolved. Thank you.
Do you have a specific definitive answer now to?
I believe that Mr. Spiegel is correct. It is an independent notice.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Jonathan Davis, Precinct 10. Mr. Moderator, I have a question and then a couple of comments. The question is picking up on something that you had mentioned earlier about the next town meeting perhaps being, you had suggested in September, but since we don't know what it would be, it might even be as early as July or August. I'm wondering if this is an opportune moment to for an amendment to specify the fall town meeting. I leave it to you, I put that out there to you and perhaps to Mr. Spiegel.
Well, Mr. Davis, I think the amount of examination that a selectmen's committee is going to have to do is pretty minimal, and that it can be done in a relatively short time, and that if we hold our next town meeting in September, their work would have been completed in adequate time for that. Mr. Spiegel nods his head yes.
Okay.
For what that's worth.
I do have a couple of comments.
Go ahead.
One comment is that it seems to me that disabled and elderly people may have difficulty even hobbling to the library to read the to get to a computer terminal. And the other point is it strikes me as very strange that here we have a town budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and we are fussing about an extraordinary, unusual expenditure of $6,000 some odd dollars when we've got hundreds of millions of dollars that we've just handed over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. I'm going to call on Mr. Gordon. Seems to me that's a fair point, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1, Brookline Constable, and co-chair with Marty Rosenthal of Brookline PACS. To any constable of the town of Brookline, greetings. In the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you are hereby required to notify and warn the inhabitants of the town of Brookline. So reads the warrant for this town meeting, which as a Brookline constable I posted some weeks ago by hand in each of Brookline's 16 precincts. In addition to our constables posting of the warrant, year after year, town meeting after town meeting, the warrant has been published in its entirety in our local newspaper. We don't know how many people read it, but we do know that nobody in particular noted the cost of printing it until the fall of 2016. The fall of 2016 and a town meeting warrant of an astounding 135 pages filled with a slew of zoning bylaw amendments. And on that absolute outlier of a warrant, some feel compelled to change something we never thought was broken. A part of me resists the change in publishing the complete warrant because despite modern pressures, Brookline remains a New England town. We retain a citizen legislature and other elements of town government. And we continue to post physical copies of our town meeting warrants in our schools, our libraries, our firehouses, and our parks. Not URLs, not summaries, not indexes. Actual complete paper warrants posted throughout the town. And yes, people read these posted warrants. To me, it doesn't matter how many. I suspect that some read the warrants that are printed in the tab. As a fellow town meeting member suggested to me last week that I don't need to name, you know who this is. A large magnifier is sufficient companion to the small print. Tradition and the small number of people we may be reaching through the tab aside, the notion of publishing anything less than the warrant concerns me, at least sufficiently to speak about it tonight. I repeat the words of the warrant. In the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you are hereby required to notify and warn the inhabitants of the town, not just the town meeting members, the inhabitants of the town. There's a common refrain in Brookline and in many other towns when contentious issues arise and are decided by selectmen, school committees, or town meeting. It's called, "We didn't know." When were the meetings? Why didn't anyone tell us? Is an index sufficient warning to the inhabitants of the subject matter of a warrant article? Would a summary be sufficient? I think not. The issues presented in Article 10 remain straightforward. On one side of the argument, we save a few dollars and some staff time. On the other side, on my side, on the side that's backed by Brookline PACs, we seek to retain full disclosure, fair warning, and transparency. Let's inform as best we can and encourage citizen awareness and participation in our local government. We can do better than Article 10. I recommend a vote of favorable action on the advisory committee, the Stanley Spiegel motion to refer, and otherwise recommend a vote of no action on Article 10.
Mr. White? Called on Mr. White, so we'll hear what he has to say, if he wishes to
Well,
go against it.
this is subject I happen to
Who
know
are you, sir?
George Abbott White, Precinct 9. It's a subject I happen to know something about. I supervised a student newspaper for more than 20 years, and I think I care a lot about print. There are lots of ways of publishing, but I think what Mr. Gordon said and what Mr. Spiegel's put forward are extremely important. A friend of mine at Apple Computer said 20 years ago, any fool can publish on the web. Any fool can publish on the web. It's true that you can manipulate print when you print it, but not so easily. I think that in a few days, students in this school, young people, will have published 3 complete newspapers. They will be publishing a special issue on John F. Kennedy. They will be publishing a graduation issue, and they will be publishing a June issue, all at once, okay? This is not rocket science, and it's not that expensive. I think that the arguments for referring this, giving it a good hard look, and going forward on it are extremely important. I would not want to give away that kind of print to easily manipulable stuff in the ozone. And I've got a cell phone, and I read stuff online too, and I don't trust it. Thank you.
The question's been called. I think we've heard adequate amount on all sides of this issue. I have no more speakers signed up. Ms. Joswicki and Mr. Ananian are at the microphones. All those in favor of calling the question, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. We will first vote on the
Can I ask for a recorded vote, please?
electronic vote.
Yes.
You certainly may. This is on the Spiegel motion to refer. Those, how many would like a electronic vote? Plenty. This is Article 10, motion to refer. Vote at any time. Press 1 if you favor the Spiegel motion to refer, 2 if you oppose it, and 3 if you're abstaining. Motion carries by a vote of 174 in favor, 34 opposed, and 3 abstentions. We will not, therefore, deal with the main motion. Article 11. The motion under Article 11 is found on starts at the bottom of page 11-8 over to 11-12, moved by Mr. Gordon, seconded by Ms. Heller, that the town amend the campaign bylaw as set forth in the motion. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm still Neil Gordon, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1. I'm also the go-to guy in Brookline when it comes to campaign finance reporting. I serve as treasurer for 3 campaign finance committees for Selectmen Franco, Green, and Wyszynski, and served as treasurer of the Vote Yes for Brookline Ballot Question Committee. I speak today as the primary petitioner of Warrant Article 11, a bylaw change that would expand campaign finance reporting and transparency on the one hand and streamline it on the other. A bit of background, and it might help to refer to the table on page 11-8 of the combined reports. Under Massachusetts law, candidates for townwide office are required to file with the town clerk periodic campaign finance reports. For the most part, that means public disclosure of money raised and money spent. Reports are filed 8 days before an election, 30 days after, and at year end. For selectmen candidates, our current bylaw goes further, requiring a special Brookline campaign finance report 15 days before an election, a week earlier than the state-mandated filing. Warrant Article 11 would broaden that 1 week earlier requirement to include not only selectmen candidates, but all townwide candidates and ballot question committees. The extra week will provide the public with important campaign finance information early enough to respond, perhaps with a mailing of campaign material, a letter to the tab, or an email or social media campaign. Brookline's bylaws currently also require from selectmen candidates more detail than the state does, and that added detail requires a somewhat burdensome filing of a separate Brookline reporting form, not only 2 weeks before an election, but also alongside the state reports 3 more times a year, 8 days before an election, 30 days after, and at year end. In every report, both the state report and the Brookline report, for all candidates for townwide office, as well as ballot question committees, this is currently, donors' names and addresses are listed for all donations over $50. On the town report for selectmen, the total number of contributions of $50 or less is shown. Interesting perhaps, but little more than that. On the state report, a donor's occupation and employer are also disclosed with a $200 trigger. For the separate town report for selectmen candidates only, disclosure of employer and occupation is triggered for any contribution over $50. For that marginal information, occupation and employer, for contributions over $50 but less than $200, nearly all of which can be found with a Google search anyway, subject parties are required to file 3 mostly redundant parallel campaign finance reports 8 days before an election, 30 days after, and at year end. I know firsthand the extra effort of the parallel reporting, including the work of the town clerk in processing these reports and occasionally chasing them down, and of the limited value the public gets in return. In the interest of timely disclosure and transparency, Article 11 expands the 1 week earlier disclosure requirement from just selectmen candidates to all townwide candidates and ballot question committees. At the same time, Article 11 proposes aligning disclosure thresholds to the state amount, streamlining reporting that would have been further complicated by adding all townwide offices to the mix. I think it's a fair trade.
1 minute.
And ask you for a vote of favorable action on Article 11.
Thank you, Mr. Sandman.
Mike Sandman, town meeting member from Precinct 3, speaking for the advisory committee. There we go. Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Friedman, for pointing out the deficiencies in the written report that I produced initially for the advisory committee and getting me to make that. Because I think that if you read the full text of the modifications in the bylaw that are being proposed by the petitioner, your eyes may cross and your heart rhythm may become unstable. And I'll just read briefly a sentence. On or before the 15th day preceding the annual town election, and in the case of a ballot question committee, any town election for which an applicable ballot question appears on the ballot, each ballot question committee and each candidate for the office of selectman, school committee, library trustee, housing authority, moderator, town clerk, and constable shall file with the town clerk, etc. Okay, so that's Greek, or at least it is to most people who read it. What this article is about is the expansion of a reporting requirement that Brookline has over and above what the state requires for townwide candidates. So currently, candidates for selectmen are required to comply with this regulation or this bylaw. If Article 11 is approved, all 7 townwide offices, candidates for all 7 townwide offices will be required to comply with it. They are already required to comply with the state requirements, which necessitate filing campaign reports 8 days before an election and 30 days after, and at the end of the year, if the campaign committee has had more than $1,000 in transactions. Since they're already filing state reports, filing an additional town report is not a big deal, and I say that to you as somebody who has chaired, rather been treasurer of a selectmen's campaign. The chart shows you that the expansion, if Article 11 is approved, to all 7 wide town offices would occur. It shows you that the current regulation, current requirement of Brookline, that the number of contributors of less than $50 needs to be reported will no longer be required. And it shows you that contributions between $50 and $200, $199.99, will still need to be reported, but individually, but the occupation and employer information that must currently be solicited from the contributor need not be provided if the contribution is less than $200. If the contribution is $200 or more, the names of contributors will be reported, as currently is the case, and the occupation and employer's name must be requested in writing and reported if provided. The purpose of that $200 threshold is to give the public information when a substantial number of people from one particular occupation or one particular area of interest have contributed heavily to a campaign. The advantage of requiring that information 15 days in advance is, I think, obvious to anybody who's run for office or been closely acquainted with the campaign. It's just useful to know who's supporting the competing candidates. On the other hand,
1 minute.
Right. On the other hand, the threshold for reporting contributions between $50 and $200 goes back to the original state legislation in 1973, when apparently $50 actually could buy you some influence. That doesn't really tend to be the case anymore. So there's your summary. That's what changes. It's 3 very simple changes in effect. The advisory committee, by a vote of 21-0 with 3 abstentions, recommends favorable action on the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Heller.
Nancy Heller for Unanimous Board of Selectmen. We recognize the difficulty in recruiting treasurers for local political campaigns. Frankly, being the treasurer is sometimes a pain in the neck, as I'm sure Mr. Gordon will attest to, since he's done so many of them. He, however, has not ever done mine, So I decided to call the treasurer of my recent selectman campaign, and she was the treasurer of my school committee campaigns in the past. And she felt that the simplification was a good thing because right now she's managing 2 forms with different information. And the information is, and the requirement to seek the name and occupation by written request is really a pain in the neck. To seek the people between 50 and 200, because a lot of times people are careless about how they're not trying to hide anything, they're just careless about how they fill out the form. They want to do it quickly and get on to the party, or get on to the event, or get on to whatever it is they're doing. And so I think that it makes sense to enact this simplification. It provides relief to the treasurers, who are currently, as I said, required to make written efforts to collect information when people neglect to fill their cards out correctly if they're giving under $200. And that's collection of the information is about time and patience, and it can be frustrating. And my treasurer in particular wouldn't let go, so 2 times wasn't enough. She would have to continue until we called the person and hounded them for the information. The bylaw revision would now match state law, and that could also mean a simplification in the forms that we have to file with the town clerk, because the town clerk could really, in essence, adopt the state form. Now, also, we would not have to aggregate the contributions of 50 or less, and we wouldn't have to do our local requirement that the number of contributors be reported, but just aggregate the amount, which again is a time saver for treasurers. Now, the bylaw does expand the reporting to all townwide offices, but they have to report anyway under the state law. So if there's the same or very similar form that they're filing, there's really no difference. The major difference with state law is the 15-day requirement of filing 15 days before an election. And I see the wisdom of that because it gives local candidates an option to understand what their situation is, how much more money they need to raise, etc., and also understand what the opposition is doing, especially in the ballot races. So this will be an addition and a relief for campaign treasurers, a relief for the candidates, and I don't think it really has a significant effect on the amount of information that the voters are getting. We unanimously support the advisory committee's motion to reform the Brookline's campaign finance requirements, and hope that the town clerk will see the wisdom, if this passes, see the wisdom of using a simple form, the state form. Thank you.
Thank you. No need to call the question. I have no more speakers on the motion.
Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Davis.
Jonathan Davis, Precinct 10. I do have a question, Mr. Moderator. It appears from the combined reports that the state does not require this kind of financial reporting for ballot question committees, whereas the article would. Is that a correct reading or not?
Well, we'll have to ask one of the experts. Mr. Sandman?
I believe the state does require for ballot question campaign committees. The difference between the state and the Brookline rules is that the state requires it 8 days before an election. The Brookline rule requires it 15 days before the election.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Richmond.
Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. So if we've been talking about how this is going to ease things for treasurers, but it's actually not for the other 7 townwide offices. I don't. But and are we filing 3 reports for other townwide offices, 8 and 15, or is 15 substituting for 8?
Mr. Sandman?
So, first of all, anyone who's currently running for office, townwide office, and who spends more than $1,000 has to file the state report 8 days in advance. The Brookline requirement requirement currently only requires selectmen to file 15 days in advance as well as 8 days in advance. What would be added by this article is a requirement for the other 6 townwide offices campaigns to file, if they spent more than $1,000, an additional report 15 days in advance. I can tell you, again, from my experiences being a treasurer, that that's not a particularly onerous task if with the other changes that are suggested are made. That is, if one doesn't have to go chasing people for names and addresses and so forth.
I guess I would comment, I don't see how having 2 reports is streamlining. 8 and 15, where we only have to do 8 today.
Thank you. Mr. Burstein?
Michael Burstein, town meeting member, precinct 12, and library trustee with the campaign committee. I'm confused about 2 things. Does this mean that if I were to have to file 15 days and 8 days, the way it works now, you're filing up to a certain time period in these? So does that literally mean that the 8-day report would cover only a week's worth of expenditure? Because you're filing that after you file the 15-day report. That's the first question.
Well, Mr. Sandman, I don't think was listening.
The question is, the way that the filing works is that you're supposed to file up until the deadline, then you file up to the next deadline. When you file the 30-day after, you're only filing for everything did from the 8-day before to the 30 after.
Right.
Does this mean that those of us who are not selectmen or everybody running would have to file an 8-day report that basically covers 1 week of time between the 15-day and the 8-day? You're just filing to say, okay, the 15-day report is everything from January 1st to the 15-day.
That's right. And
then you're going to file another report that says, and during that week, I did this.
Well, as a practical matter, what you do is simply add on that because you're filing in conformance with the state rules, you add the next week into the existing report.
Okay. Mr. Moderator, my second question is, would the town clerk's office be available to help out those of us who are not quite sure how this is going to work once this article passes?
I'm sure the answer to that question is yes. Despite resistance on the stage. On the motion at the bottom of page 11-8, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries by a vote of 192 to 4. We've dealt with Article 12 and now move to Article 13. Before we get there, there's a correction on the vote on Article 10, the Spiegel motion to refer. The vote was 173 in favor, 36 opposed, and 3 abstentions. Article 13 provides you with the town meeting members' nightmare, and that is 2 very similar but different motions relating to the same subject matter. And so you're going to have to listen very carefully to the differences as explained by the various speakers. The main motion is on the Brown supplement, pages 3 and 4, moved by Mr. Gordon, seconded by Mr. Lynn Jones, relating these amendments to the bylaw on sale and distribution of tobacco products. The selectmen offer a what I am going to treat as a substitute motion on pages 13-3, moved by Mr. Green and seconded by Mr. Wyszynski. Mr. Gordon, for the main motion. The way we'll treat a substitute motion is we'll vote on that first, just like an amendment, and if it passes, we'll vote on it again, because that becomes the main motion. If it fails, then we'll vote on the advisory committee motion. Mr. Gordon. I'll explain that again when we get to the voting.
Neil Gordon, Precinct 1, speaking for the advisory committee. So you'll shortly vote on two dueling motions to control tobacco sales in Brookline. Article 13, in either the form offered by the advisory committee or the form offered by the selectmen, proposes a substantially broader limitation on tobacco than any passed by a previous Brookline town meeting. Favorable action on either motion would limit the number of tobacco sales permits to those currently existing and impose significant limitations on their transfer. Existing permitted businesses can continue to sell tobacco, but no new permits will be issued. So if you like your tobacco permit, you can keep your tobacco permit. But if it's surrendered or otherwise lost, or if your business closes, that tobacco sales permit is gone forever. Further transfers of tobacco sales permits could only be made to acquirers intending to operate businesses in substantially the same manner as the prior owners. A gas station selling tobacco won't become a liquor store selling tobacco. A liquor store won't become a convenience store. Neither gas stations, liquor stores, nor convenience stores could become cigar stores. As businesses inevitably close over time, the number of tobacco sales permits will decline, eventually to zero, and tobacco will no longer be sold in Brookline. It's around some important edges that the advisory committee disagrees with the selectmen, hence the dueling motions. The majority of the advisory committee initially opposed favorable action on Article 13, either in principle or because the language they felt was ambiguous or unworkable. Restricting the transfer of tobacco permits to just one subsequent owner was felt by some to be an unfair targeted restriction on private businesses, and one that would presumably unfairly decrease the value of those businesses. Similarly, several advisory committee members felt that restricting the transfer of tobacco permits would adversely impact the owners of gasoline stations in particular, with the potentially unintended consequence of the further closure of such businesses in Brookline. Several committee members noted the language of the proposed bylaw amendment would treat sole proprietors differently from corporate or similar entities, where an individual owner would be limited to a single transfer of ownership. Sales in a corporation could be sold and resold without limit, without any transfer of direct ownership of the business. Some committee members felt that legally sophisticated holders of permits would skirt the bylaw, while less sophisticated holders of permits would suffer its consequences. Some felt that language in the proposed bylaw that would require subsequent owners to express their intent to operate in the same location as the prior owner to be overly restrictive and or ambiguous. For example, in the case of a fire or loss of lease, a permit for the sale of tobacco might not be issued except for the location that was no longer available. Lastly, the permitting process is currently subject only to procedures established by the Department of Public Health. Some advisory committee members expressed concern that a zealous director, even in good faith, might impose rules that could cause the inadvertent loss of a permit to sell tobacco. Under the selectmen's motion, such permit could not then be renewed. Despite Article 13's good intentions, these expressed concerns initially motivated the advisory committee to recommend referral of the subject matter of the article back to the Tobacco Control Committee. More recently, however, the advisory committee considered a revised motion, one that removes the one-time only transfer and same location restrictions and adds a right of appeal of a loss of license or fine to the Board of Selectmen. Accordingly, by a vote of 22 in favor, 2 opposed, and no abstentions, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on its motion on Article 13.
Thank you, Mr. Green. And Mr. Friedman, would you come forward?
Good evening, Bernard Green for the Board of Selectmen. Warrant Article 13 was submitted by the Tobacco Control Committee, chaired by former Selectwoman Nancy Daly. It proposes to limit tobacco use by restricting and ultimately eliminating tobacco permits, and thereby ultimately eliminating the legal sale of tobacco products in Brookline. The Selectmen's desire to restrict tobacco usage is motivated primarily by the health impacts of tobacco usage and the medical and social costs associated with those health impacts, which we all know about, and it would serve no real purpose for me to repeat. The Selectmen's motion would accomplish the goal of reducing tobacco usage by the following. Similar to the Advisory Committee's motion, beginning September 1st, 2017, no new permits would be issued. The Advisory Committee, of course, adds or the later of when the Attorney General approves the warrant article or the bylaw. Existing permit holders could keep their permits and continue to renew them, but must do so in a timely manner. We both added, instead of the language that required or resulted in the failure that resulted in the loss of eligibility for a permit upon a failure to timely renew. We added language, failure to timely renew may result in notice from the health department and revocation of the right to apply for the permit or a fine in accordance with health department procedures. Permit holders could transfer the right to apply for a permit with the sale of their business, but just once and only if the buyer maintains substantially the same business in the same location. The new owner would have to apply for a permit within 60 days, and subsequent buyers would not be eligible to apply for a permit. So that third generation could not continue the tobacco usage business or tobacco sale business. The Advisory Committee's motion differs, among other ways, from the Selectmen's motion by the effective date being the later of when the Attorney General approves, or September 1st, as I mentioned before. They also have the language regarding the failure to timely renew resulting in revocation or fine, but then they add the right of a business to file an appeal to the Board of Selectmen within 30 days. The Advisory Committee also deleted the requirement that a subsequent owner would have to operate in the same location. And they deleted the limitation to just one time that the right to apply for a permit could be transferred. The Selectmen's original motion was voted 5-0 in favor on April 4th. And then last night, the Selectmen declined to reconsider that vote and thereby declined to vote on the Advisory Committee motion, or no motion at all, by a vote of 4-1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman.
Harry
Mr.
Friedman.
Vitolo, would you come forward? Sorry, go ahead.
Harry Friedman, Precinct 12, speaking in favor of the Advisory Committee's motion and against the Selectmen's substitute motion. As Neil Gordon explained, the Selectmen's substitute motion would permit business owners who currently have licenses to sell tobacco to sell the business to a new owner, who in turn could sell tobacco. However, anyone purchasing from the new owner would be prohibited from selling tobacco. What damn fool would purchase a business that currently sells tobacco, but where he would not be able to sell to anyone else who could sell tobacco? The only kind of reasonable person who would make such a purchase would demand a steep reduction in price of the business he was buying. What would this do to the 21 business owners who currently have tobacco licenses? It would seriously decrease the value of their businesses, destroy part of their wealth, and jeopardize eventual retirement plans. You might ask how just the loss of tobacco sales might do this. The answer lies in the ancillary sales. A customer who stops in to buy cigarettes makes other purchases. He might fill his gas tank, buy a quart of milk, get some chips, or maybe one of those horrible beef jerky things that sits next to the register wrapped in cellophane. If the customer can't buy cigarettes, he won't even stop in the Brookline gas station. He'll go to West Roxbury or to Newton, get his tobacco there, along with all his other purchases, including the horrible little beef jerky thing that sits next to the register. What was once a profitable Brookline business could easily become a money-losing business. We can easily see the harm that is caused by the selectmen's substitute motion. But what of the good that ensues? Well, the article really doesn't address teen smoking because it's already illegal to sell tobacco products to those under 21 in the town of Brookline. The selectmen's motion addresses adult smoking. It could easily work to reduce adult smoking if we lived on an island and there was nowhere else to go to purchase tobacco. However, we don't. We're part of a large metropolitan area, and it is easy enough to drive, walk, bike, roller skate, or take public transport to Cleveland Circle, Alston, the Fenway, West Rocks, or Newton in order to get tobacco and make all of their other purchases, including the horrible little beef jerky thing. However, one legitimate argument that proponents can point to would be the statement that we would be making as a community. We would be declaring to one and all that the town of Brookline seeks to be a tobacco-free zone, and this is the type of statement and the type of community we wish to present to the rest of the world. I have some sympathy for that argument. I don't smoke. I don't like being around those who are smoking when I'm around them, and I would like to see a cigarette-free world. However, when you adopt a policy meant as a community good, a community benefit, then any costs associated with that policy should be borne by the entire community. The 58,000 residents of the town of Brookline should share the costs. That is not happening with the selectmen's motion. The cost of this policy would be shouldered on the backs of 21 business owners, no more, no less. This is simply not fair. It is wrong. I would think the town would seek to encourage businesses, not discourage them. New businesses make our retail environment more interesting, and for those who still drive cars powered by gasoline, a place to fill up. The taxes they generate help all of us.
You have 1 minute.
Brookline is not the easiest place in which to run a business. If you want to put up a sign, there are 6 pages of zoning regs. Bags for your customers, we regulate that. Taxes higher than those on residential properties, but we have never been confiscatory. We can do better than the selectmen's motion. The motion offered by advisory is that better solution. It effectively caps the number of tobacco licenses in Brookline at 21. If a current business owner, say a convenience store owner, sells his business to someone new and that person turns it into a cafe, the license will be lost and the town will now be capped at 20. This is a strong statement about how we as a community feel about tobacco without hurting current business owners. Please join me in rejecting the selectmen's motion and in supporting the advisory committee's motion.
Mr. Vitolo.
Tommy Vitolo, town meeting member, Precinct 6. Here we are in 2017 with smoking on the decline, but still widely embraced, from kids to seniors. Our addicted friends and neighbors certainly don't want asthma, stroke, heart disease, emphysema, or cancer. If cigarettes were invented today, they'd never be permitted to be sold. They're the only product out there that cause physical damage to the body every single time they're used when used exactly as instructed. 1 in 5 Americans die because of smoking, more than caused by HIV, illegal drug use, alcohol use, car crashes, and guns combined. We can't simply ban the sale of cigarettes in Brookline effective tomorrow. It's too abrupt a change. Smokers have invested significant resources in becoming addicted, and about 20 businesses in Brookline have invested significant resources in profiting from that addiction. What we can do is say, not more. No new businesses will be permitted to get tobacco permits. And that's the AC motion, more or less, and it's a pretty good motion. We can do better, though. We can also help ensure that existing businesses, all existing businesses that sell tobacco products, will eventually stop selling tobacco products. We can enact policy that allows current business owners to sell their businesses with tobacco sales intact. But once that business reaches its third owner, tobacco can't be a part of their business model. Whereas the AC motion says no additional stores, the Board of Selectmen motion says no additional stores and an eventual extinction of all tobacco sales in Brookline. The Selectmen's motion is a long-term, gradual phasing out of the sale of tobacco in our town, all the while protecting current business owners' operations and current business owners' ability to sell their business tobacco sales intact. Let's finally set our sights on eliminating the sale of tobacco in Brookline. If not in our lifetime, at least eventually. Let's vote yes for the Selectmen's substitute motion and yes on the main motion. Thank you.
Mr. Audi?
Good evening. My name is Elias Audi. I'm a board member of the Chamber of Commerce and a past president. And here I am to state to you the position the Chamber of Commerce took on April 20 at its Board of Director meetings regarding this article. The Chamber applauds Selectman Daley and the Tobacco Control Committee on the work they have done to examine the feasibility and impact of stronger anti-tobacco measures in Brookline. Although the Chamber appreciates the article's public health objective, the Chamber opposes Article 13. The proposed restrictions on the issuance and transferability of tobacco license put Brookline businesses at a disadvantage to tobacco vendors in neighboring cities and towns that aren't subject to similar restrictions. Furthermore, the one-time limitation on the transferability of existing tobacco licenses could have a considerable impact on the valuation of local businesses and place local business owners looking to sell or relocate their businesses at a significant disadvantage. Finally, the ambiguity of the article's language around important issues such as outlining the mechanism for how and when prospective buyers of tobacco vending businesses would be notified of a licensing restrictions. It creates an uncertainty that could also be detrimental to local business community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daley.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Nancy Daly, town meeting member from Precinct 12, and I served as the chairman of the Selectmen's Tobacco Control Committee. As you just heard from Tommy, smoking is the leading cause of preventable death in America. Smokers, on average, die 10 years earlier than non-smokers. There are 480,000 deaths a year in the U.S. attributed to smoking-related issues, and this includes more than 41,000 from secondhand smoke exposure. More than 16 million Americans are living with diseases caused by smoking, and the total economic cost of smoking is $300 billion a year, split between direct medical costs, and lost productivity. The Tobacco Control Committee was particularly concerned about the effects of smoking on our youth. According to the CDC, tobacco use is started and established primarily during adolescence. Nearly 9 out of 10 smokers tried their first cigarette by age 18. And nationwide, each day, more than 3,200 people younger than 18 smoke their first cigarette. Data shows a correlation between the number of establishments that sell tobacco in a community and the number of people who begin smoking. Young people get addicted to nicotine faster than adults, and many underage smokers have indicated that even though it's not legal for them to buy this product, they can get it from friends or family. As the committee learned these facts, we focused on how to reduce the number of places in Brookline that sell tobacco products. You probably remember that CVS gave up the sale of tobacco products in September 2014. The CEO of CVS Health recently said that they were very happy that they had made that decision. Previously, CVS had about $2 billion in tobacco sales, but they were able to find other products to substitute for that revenue. They also found that some smokers in areas where CVS had a significant presence quit after CVS stopped selling those products. The majority of the Tobacco Control Committee would have liked to totally eliminate tobacco permits in Brookline, but we crafted a warrant article that tried to offer a compromise between our desire to decrease the number of tobacco permits and the needs of Brookline merchants for whom tobacco sales make up a significant portion of their revenue. We had the holder of 2 tobacco permits as a member of the committee, and we listened to his concerns and tried to incorporate them. The version offered by the selectmen, which is very close to what the Tobacco Control Committee originally submitted to the warrant, would allow current permit holders to keep their permits but not grant any new permits, and current permit holders could sell their business one time and there would be a presumption that the new owner would get a permit if they were doing the same business in the same location. With subsequent changes in ownership, those permits would not be available. Therefore, we would get a gradual reduction in the number of permits, but the current businesses would not have a dramatic reduction in the value of their business. In fact, we have heard anecdotally that businesses see substantial value to having these permits when no new ones are being issued during this interim period. This also would give people in that business quite a long time to revise their business model and figure out other products to sell to allow them to prosper, as CVS did when it lost its $2 billion in tobacco sales. The advisory committee version would allow unlimited sales of businesses with the presumption that all future owners would get tobacco permits, so there would never be any reduction from the current number. If we can deter any young people from beginning to smoke or help others to quit, we are likely to improve their health for life. Let's lead on this issue as we did on eliminating smoking in restaurants, and let the other communities follow. The Tobacco Control Committee urges you to vote for the Selectmen's motion on Article 13 and not the advisory committee version. Thank you.
Mr. Joswicki.
Hi, I'm Bart Joswicki. I am a town meeting member from Precinct 9. I agree with the intent and where this, both sides are going. I stopped smoking 40 years ago. I'm damn proud of it. But isn't what we are doing here called prohibition? How did that work out? What do we do next? On television, I watched a show about giving babies orange juice, too much sugar, limit it, cut it down. Should we go cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs? Stop all the stores from selling sugar? I'd like to know if somebody has the death rates of people who consume too much sugar, buy it in our stores, give it to our kids. I agree, guys, with where you're going with this, but the prohibition angle just, for me, doesn't work.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Jonathan Davis, Precinct 10. Mr. Moderator, I'm a little, I confess to being a little confused by both of the proposals. And unfortunately, both of them seem to talk about acquiring, but then later they talk about buyers. And my question for both the advisory committee and for the Board of Selectmen is what happens in the case of an inheritance? The inheritor is the heir, or the devisee is not going to be buying, but maybe is going to be an acquirer. Is he or she an acquirer? So I'm not sure that this is really ready for prime time. I do agree with the objective, but I do have that question. So that's one point that puzzles me. I'm a little bit puzzled about what happens if there is a corporation, for example, that has a permit and then the shares in the corporation are either sold or the corporation issues new shares and you get additional owners. I'm not sure how it works in that situation. I'm not sure what happens if you have reverse mergers. I'm not sure that this thing is quite ready for prime time. And the last point that I would make, Mr. Moderator, is it seems to me that we're really creating, in a sense, like another taxi license, because we are now increasing the value of the ability to sell tobacco in this town. So I'm on general, all of those grounds, frankly, I don't think that this is quite ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sandman?
Mike Sandman, town meeting member, Precinct 3, member of the advisory committee, but speaking on my own. One of the issues that I was going to speak to was just raised by Mr. Davis. That is, the selectman's motion talks about the seller of a business, but certainly a business is dealt with in the law as an entity, and shares in that business can be sold, transferred, and so forth, without clearly triggering the restriction on the next sale of a license. So that needed to be clarified, and the advisory committee attempted to do that. There is one other issue in here that really nobody has mentioned. The selectman's motion requires a substantially similar business in the same location. Businesses occasionally move; they remain exactly the same. And they move because of a change in lease, rental costs, or something of that sort. If you require that the business stay in exactly the same location, do you not give the landlord an incredibly powerful tool to raise the rent beyond what the rent would otherwise be? Because if the business owner moves, they're going to lose a substantial part of their value. The business, they basically triggered that one-time change in the licensing requirement. So I'd like to hear an answer to that question from the selectmen's side.
Mr. Green, I don't believe there's a quick answer to that question. Is there? I said I don't believe there's a quick answer.
Oh, I agree with the moderator. There is no quick answer. And there are a lot of issues in this motion that I think there aren't answers to. We're trying to reduce the usage of tobacco here in Brookline for obvious reasons. This is one way of attempting to start to do that. It's not perfect unless former Selectman Daley has some wisdom to impart as to some of these issues. I think that we're making a first step to begin to eliminate tobacco from Brookline.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, I think that's really just the point of the advisory committee's motion, that the selectman's motion, well-intentioned though it is, has some significant flaws in it, and I would urge you to support the advisory committee's motion.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ilan Wapinski, Precinct 7 Town Meeting Member. I was wondering if anyone knows how many of the 21 purveyors of tobacco in town are locally owned businesses versus national chains.
Does anyone have that information?
Any clue? I don't know the answer to this. They're all locally owned?
Seems that no one has an answer to that question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, sir.
Isaac Silberberg, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 14. A concern with this motion is that corporate persons, unlike natural persons, never die. Could a future town meeting create a clause within this policy in the event that a license does not transfer after a certain number of years? For instance, a sunset clause?
Not at this point.
But could a future town meeting create that?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes, Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9 again. I have, two questions. The first question is there any possible preemption issue in state law as to the selectman's motion that is ultimately designed to something I favor, which is ending tobacco sales in Brookline? But I have to wonder if that's permissible for us, and has it been done anywhere? That's my first question. I have a second question.
Town council may be able to answer that question for you.
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. There is no preemption issue, and in fact, a number of communities, I believe the number is 70 or 80 communities, have actually banned tobacco permits.
Okay, thank you. So that relieves that issue. But my second question is to the moderator. It strikes me that there are some good things in each of these motions that the other one lacks, and I wonder if you would consider a motion to refer this either to the Tobacco Control Committee or the Public Health.
I think not at this point, Mr.
Okay.
Rosenthal. It's what I pointed out as the problem for town meeting members trying to reconcile these two motions. In any case, we've run out of signed up speakers. There's no one at the microphones, and it's time to cast your votes. We vote first on the selectman's motion, which is a substitution entirely for the main motion. And if there are 35 people who would like a electronic vote, we'll have one. And there are. This is Article 13 substitute motion. Or why don't you just say Article 13 BOS motion. Board of Selectmen. Okay, the voting period has started. A yes vote is in favor of the Selectmen's motion, which is on page 13-3. A no vote is a vote against it. Motion fails by a vote of 50 in favor, 142 against, and 2 abstentions. On the advisory committee's motion, on the Brown supplement, pages 3 and 4, those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed, that motion carries by a majority vote. We turn now to Article 14. The motion is on page 14-6 over to page 14-7. Moved by Mr. Franco, seconded by Mr. Selwyn, to change the zoning bylaw relating to recreational marijuana establishments in a way that Mr. Franco will now tell us. As you leave the auditorium, please don't forget to turn in your handheld devices.
Ben Franco for the Board of Selectmen. On November 6, 2016, Massachusetts voters approved a ballot law legalizing the possession and use of marijuana and authorizing a retail pot industry. More than 6 months later, the question of who will be in charge of overseeing the marijuana industry and the regulations that will govern it remain up in the air. This uncertainty explains why the Board of Selectmen supports imposing a temporary moratorium on allowing the recreational marijuana industry to operate in Brookline. Before the town can adopt the bylaws, procedures, and zoning needed to regulate the operations and siting of retail and grow facilities, it needs to know exactly what the state's regulations will be and what regulating authorization will be delegated to cities and towns. The appointment of the Cannabis Control Commission, the body empowered to regulate the marijuana industry under the November 2016 vote, and the regulations governing the industry in Massachusetts will not be in place until at least 2018, and that date is beginning to appear increasingly optimistic as the legislature and governor have indicated that they intend to make changes to the voter-approved initiative, and the governor's office has yet to release the funds to the state treasurer's office necessary to begin to set up the Cannabis Control Commission's framework. Brookline is not the first community to seek a temporary moratorium on the operation of the recreational marijuana industry for the reasons I've articulated. More than half a dozen cities and towns have already approved temporary moratoriums, and 70 other municipalities are considering moratoriums this spring. Should the proposed temporary moratorium pass, and once there is more certainty about the state's regulatory framework, the Selectmen's Licensing Review Committee, with the support of relevant town departments, will consider what appropriate local regulations should be on the operations of the marijuana industry in Brookline. As part of this public process, input from all interested parties will be sought. This is the same model that we followed several years ago when recreational marijuana was legalized. By a vote of 5-0, the Board of Selectmen urges favorable action on Article 14.
Thank you, Ms. Hamlin.
Linda Hamlin. I'm chair of the planning board, and I don't really have anything to add to that summary because I think this is a procedural question of getting the moratorium in place, and we will have a lot more time in the future to discuss what our regulations, what our zoning bylaws will be, and your vote on what they will be. So I would just recommend favorable action on this article as we did at the planning board.
Thank you, Mr. Selwyn.
Lee Selwyn, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13, speaking for the Advisory Committee. I don't know who takes credit for the order of these warrant articles, but I think it's sort of interesting that we went from smoking to toking. And while we are, we were just discussing eliminating the sale of tobacco, we seem to be morphing into facilitating the sale of pot. The voters last year approved a ballot question, and certainly the majority of Brookline voters shared in that approval. But the ballot question itself was far more than a simple yes/no on legalization of recreational marijuana. It was a complex structure that involved requirements for licensing, for opting out, and a whole bunch of other things that I suspect, I don't have any evidence other than anecdotal, but I suspect that an extraordinarily small percentage of those who voted in favor of that ballot question ever bothered to read. In any event, the legislature is, as Selectman Franco mentioned, the legislature is looking into revising and modifying the statute as adopted by the electorate. And the action under Article 14 is sort of a holding action, and what I'm going to do very briefly is describe to you what it's doing and then explain if my understanding of what the consequences would be if we didn't adopt it. Article 14 first defines in the zoning bylaw a recreational marijuana establishment, and it assigns it a use code in the bylaw, and then it proceeds to prohibit for a stated period of time the creation of any such or the location of any of such establishment in every zoning district in the town. In fact, there are actually two separate moratoria. Originally, the original version of this article would have established a moratorium running through April 15th, 2019. The Attorney General's office indicated that they might look askance at anything that went beyond December 31st, 2018. So what was done was to split that into two pieces. So we have two moratoria, one that runs through December 31st, 2018, and then immediately a new moratorium that begins at the stroke of midnight and runs through April 15th, 2019. So if the second one gets disallowed, at least the first will stand intact. It is currently anticipated that the earliest that the state regulations might be adopted is something in the range of March 15th of 2018. That would be too late for the spring town meeting warrant, and unless we have another special town meeting to address recreational marijuana, we could not adopt any zoning until November, and we have no idea right now what we're going to be allowed to do or allowed not to do. So the purpose of the moratorium is simply to create a holding action. Here's what happens, as I understand it, if we did nothing. If we did nothing, we would not have defined this particular type of establishment. We would not have prohibited this type of establishment from being located anywhere in the town, or otherwise restricted it through zoning. And basically, we'd be leaving ourselves open to totally unknown state regulations. That is, state regulations whose exact parameters are unknown at this time. So the solution seems to be, for now, to establish a moratorium, wait and see what happens, and then address this when we know what we will be allowed to do and what we will be prohibited from doing.
30 seconds.
And bring that to a future town meeting. So by a vote of 14 in favor, 4 against, and 7 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on Article 14. Thank you.
On the motion on pages 14-6 and 7,
Question?
those in favor?
Question, Mr. Arden?
Yes, Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you. This on? So yes, Scott Gladstone, Precinct 16. Yeah, I don't think that. Scott Gladstone, Precinct 16. I was hoping I'd get the answer to this from Mr. Selwyn, but I'm still a little unclear. I actually have two questions. So one is, my understanding, and this might be wrong, I hope it's not, is that if a use is not an allowed use under our bylaw, in other words, not specifically listed as an allowed use, that it's not an allowed use. So if, for instance, as far as I know, there's not a a fireworks factory use under the bylaw. And that doesn't mean that you could put a fireworks factory anywhere in town. It means that you can't put it anywhere in town. I think that's right. That's my first question. The second question is about the definition. Now, I'm a little bit nervous about this idea of a marijuana retailer. We have other uses under the bylaw about other kinds of retailers, over 5,000 square feet, under 5,000 square feet. Is a Toys R Us that also sells marijuana, because that's allowed under the new regulations, going to be under the over 5,000 square foot use and under this use, one or the other? That seems a little confusing to me. Could someone address those two questions?
Mr. Selwyn, would you like to field those questions? Town Council? You've had your moment in the sun, have you?
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. I didn't catch the second question, but with respect to your first question, the Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act specifically permits the establishment of marijuana retailers. It leaves it to the town to adopt an ordinance or bylaw, or in the case of Brookline, a bylaw that would either ban or limit the number of marijuana dispensaries. So that would preempt
So in other
the
words,
lack of a use in the zoning bylaw.
So in other words, because we're only allowed to ban or limit, if we don't do either, then it's your opinion that it could be anywhere.
I believe so. That is correct.
Okay.
Your second question, Mr. Gladstone?
The second question was, should we be doing a better job of defining the use? Because some stores, for instance, instead of, or in addition to selling tobacco amongst the Twinkies and the jerky, we also want to sell marijuana. Is that going to then fall under this use 20C, or one of the other uses that could describe it as a retail store?
Well, we can't do that at this town meeting, Mr. Gladstone.
That's why it's a question.
Okay.
I believe that's a question for a future date.
Okay.
Ms. Pelkey?
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Linda Olson, Pelkey, Precinct 2. I just wanted to express my concern and hopeful aspiration that when it comes time to write the zoning for this use, that we employ the zoning bylaw committee. I'm pretty proud of the work that we did for the medical marijuana dispensary facilities, and I think it could be a very helpful addition. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure the Board of Selectmen will take that into consideration. Mr. Richmond?
Point of clarification, Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. Aren't we already under a de facto ban until the state issues regulations, which, if I'm reading this correctly, could be as late as March 15th, 2018? In other words, is it premature to be bringing this? Are we already under a ban or not?
Town Council?
Jocelyn Murphy, Town Council. The Act permits the establishment of these facilities by a date certain. I've forgotten what the date is, but in any event, the moratorium would take us through that date.
Thank you. On the motion on pages 14-6 to 7, those in favor, please raise your, this requires a 2/3 vote. Please raise your hands if you're in favor of this motion. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. Article 15. The motion is on the salmon-colored supplement, pages 3 through 7, that the town amend the Brookline zoning bylaw relating to signs. Moved by Ms. Hyatt, seconded by Mr. Lynn Jones. Ms. Hyatt.
Angela Hyatt, speaking for the advisory committee.
The Planning Board reviews applications for signs in addition to its regular zoning caseload. While new signs may involve multiple reviews to reach a decision, even an existing sign that involves only, for instance, a name change must go through the same review process as the most complex building application. This has bogged down the work of the Planning Board, especially in light of the abundance of the recent 40B projects. So with the support of the Planning Board and the Planning and Community Development Department is proposing to amend the design review procedures for signs in our zoning bylaw in order to permit the planning staff on delegated authority the ability to administratively approve an application for a proposed sign, as long as the changes are in kind or inconsequential, and as long as they adhere to the specific design guidelines adopted by the Planning Board. While the Advisory Committee agrees with the concept of delegating approval in order to streamline the process for straightforward sign applications, we raised several concerns with respect to the article as it appears in the warrant. The first concern had to do with the excessive grant of authority. While the petitioner's description of the warrant article focuses on in-kind replacement or substantially similar signs, this is actually not spelled out in the original language of the warrant, and the Advisory Committee believes that the bylaw should explicitly state that the delegated authority is limited to the approval of in-kind replacement or substantially similar signs. The next concern had to do with lack of notice. Currently, when an application for a new or replacement sign is submitted to the Planning Board, it's treated the same as other applications, which includes notifying town meeting members in affected precincts and publishing the item in the Planning Board's agenda. An aggrieved party may then appear at the Planning Board to oppose or otherwise address the sign. However, the original language of Article 15 contains no notice requirement for an application subject to administrative approval. In fact, as originally submitted, the first time that an abutter or other interested party would most likely become aware of the administrative approval is actually after the sign is physically installed. The Advisory Committee believes that notice of any administrative approval should be given in the same manner that notice is given of Planning Board meetings. Lastly, we had a concern about the lack of appeal process. As originally submitted, Article 15 states that an applicant or aggrieved party may appeal to the Board of Appeals within 30 days by special permit if he or she does not agree with the recommendations of the Planning Board. However, since the Planning Board would be delegating their authority, strictly speaking, there would be in fact no Planning Board recommendation to appeal. And while an application for a sign that is administratively denied automatically goes to the Planning Board, and therefore is subject to appeal by the applicant to the Board of Appeals, there is actually no similar appeals process for sign applications that would be administratively approved. The Advisory Committee believes that an abutter or an aggrieved party should be able to appeal the administrative approval to the Planning Board with ultimate appeal rights to the ZBA. And without the requirement for any notice to be published, a sign that is installed after the 30-day appeals period has expired would actually not be subject to appeal at all. The petitioner agreed that these concerns were in fact oversights in the original language and were not intentional omissions, and then revised the article as you see in the supplement. The Advisory Committee is comfortable with that the revised language addresses their concerns, and by a vote of 24 in favor, none opposed, and 1 abstention, we recommend favorable action on the motion in the salmon-colored supplement.
Thank you, Ms. Hamlin.
Linda Hamlin of the Planning Board. I think this warrant article came about because of several factors. One, I would like to compliment our planning department because they greet the applicants, they read the guidelines, they are very helpful in modifying plans even before they get to the Planning Board. So we have a really competent staff. We've always had it. The ones now are fabulous. The other problem that we've been having, however, is I believe the planning board, our volunteer group of 6, probably have more meetings per week than almost any other board in town. I can see weeks when I have 4 or 5 meetings, which is pretty astounding. We also have these sign cases, which are really really a very minor category. We review facades, we review signs. Some of them are very complicated. They're new people in town. They don't understand everything that we're after for a classy town. But we also have ones that are just replications, and it's this category that we'd love to give to administrative review. I think the modifications that were suggested by advisory are well taken. I think there's a real process that they can be, if there's a grievance or if there's someone that would like a change or to be notified, that's in place. I will say I've been on the planning board probably over 10 years. We have never had anyone come to a meeting to complain of a sign in this category. That's not to say that it won't happen, but that's our experience. So we feel pretty confident that this is a reasonable way to go, and it will make a much more user-friendly permitting process for those people that are simply coming for this kind of sign. We voted and encourage you to vote favorable action on this warrant article. Thank you.
Mr. Franco and Mr. Audi, if you're still in the auditorium, please come forward.
Ben Franco for unanimous Board of Selectmen. I realize the hour is late, so I'm going to curtail my remarks, so I apologize if they're disjointed. I want to take a moment and pick up on something that Ms. Hamlin said. The Planning Board is amongst the busiest boards in town. In addition to serving on a variety of ad hoc boards and committees, the board meets weekly for marathon sessions that can last more than 4 hours. I also want to thank the staff of the planning department, in addition to the board. The town's planning staff and members of the planning board have a thankless job and are frequently forced to deliver bad news to property and business owners, to explain why a needed addition or significant renovation is not possible or will require a significant amount of process, or to step into neighborhood disputes. I'm going to use the balance of my time to answer some questions that all of you might have about the legalese that's included in the zoning bylaw amendment. You may wonder how much time this change is actually going to save the planning board and staff. Staff reviewed the last 3 years of planning of sign applications and determined approximately 30% of the cases could have been administratively approved had this amendment already been in place. You may wonder how will staff know what to administratively approve and what not to. The amended version of the article is explicit in the types, in kind or similar replacement, and circumstances under which a sign could be administratively approved. You may wonder how staff will determine if something, in the words of the proposed article, proposed bylaw, is substantially similar. Again, the warrant article before town meeting references several elements that must be considered before a sign can be classified as substantially similar. The size, the color, the number, the style, the type, the location, whether the sign is illuminated. How will a staff administratively approve lead to the same design outcome as if the planning board reviewed the application? The types of signs that are the target of this change are the most straightforward applications that the planning board currently reviews, and this bylaw change will not affect the signs that are installed across town. Today, staff reviews all applications and flags any sign applications that require planning board scrutiny because their design is not appropriate for the site or neighborhood, because the proposed sign does not meet the requirements of the sign bylaw with respect to size, location, and illumination, or because there is concern about the sign's installation. Finally, will this change to the bylaw have any effect upon the ugly signs up around town that could not have possibly been approved by the sane members of the planning board? because they're so inappropriate. I agree that there is a problem in signs with a problem with signs in town. These signs are typically installed without having gone through the design review process with staff or with the planning board. So it's an enforcement issue, and we'll continue to address that on a case-by-case basis. By a vote of 5-0, the selectmen urge a vote of favorable action.
Mr. Richmond can't hold a good man down.
A lot of competition. Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. I believe Selectman Franklin answered some of my questions, but just to confirm, if you have a sign that's grandfathered in and you want to, and maybe one that's considered unattractive, I can think of one that historically it's gone, but at a store I used to shop at, Atlas Hardware, had a gigantic sign on Washington Street. Would you be able to replace that with an existing, ugly, non-conforming sign? Or, and also I wanted to know about, well, maybe I'll stop with that question and answer that one. I have two questions.
We wouldn't be able to require a grandfathered sign to be removed, surely.
That's what I was wondering. Yes,
Isn't that correct? If it's grandfathered, it's grandfathered.
So you could take a grandfathered sign, replace it with something, maybe you changed it from Atlas Hardware to Jones's Hardware, and you wouldn't have to go through review again? Mr. Moderator?
Mr. Martin?
Mr. Martin?
No.
There are dimensional requirements that would be applied to a new sign or replacement. There are dimensional requirements existing in the bylaw that would be applied to the application. So a sign that would be that's been up for a long time would be subject to those dimensional requirements as the same as the guidelines that the planning board's adopted. So it wouldn't be grandfathered in that sense, no.
Ms. Hamlin?
If it's the same business and they're repainting the sign, yes, it probably would stay. But if it's a new business, it's going to have a new name. It's not going to be. It's going to be subject to new rules and would be under our purview as on the planning board rather than administrative review.
So you're asserting that a non-conforming sign could not be grandfathered in and would have to go through, wouldn't be administratively approved?
That's my impression. I think the other thing is if it's the same business, it's Foley's Liquor, say. That sign's been up there a long time.
Excellent
they want to repaint it, it probably will get repainted. But now that's preservation probably. That's probably a whole other avenue.
Went from Foley's to Farley's. Would it be grandfathered or not?
I don't think so. I think you'd have to get a new sign review on that one, and it would not be administrative. It would be in front of the planning board.
Okay. Thank you. My second question is there such a category as signs that can violate our guidelines through special permit or approval, and would they sort of in effect be perpetually approved so that you had an approved non-conforming sign or didn't follow the guidelines, would it then not have to be re-reviewed?
Well, Ms. Hamlin?
Almost every sign is special. And where we've gotten this classification down so tightly, that is that we're replicating, that we're replicating a sign, they're repainting it, we're really gotten this down. I think your question, it's a case-by-case basis, but there are a lot of non-conforming signs in town, and a lot of them have not come before us. So it's an enforcement issue, which is, we typically, on the planning board, drive by signs, write them down. We're our own enforcement agency, but you can't do that for every sign.
My follow-up was really not about grandfathered signs, but signs that were officially approved, which might not follow the guidelines because the guidelines have some play in them. That, in other words, a sign that was approved by the planning board and under the existing process.
You'd have to go for a special permit if it's really off the guidelines. I mean,
that's what I'm saying. So if you get a special permit once, is that in perpetuity if it's the same kind of business?
We don't really grant special permits for signs.
Okay, that was my question.
They meet the guidelines,
maybe it's a non-existent
they meet
category.
the restrictions, or they don't get approved. There's no special permits or variances.
Yeah, the final,
Unless they're a height, I'm sorry,
Okay.
there's a height issue.
one final comment. A lot of comments can be submitted in writing. Not everyone's going to show up at 8 in the morning for the sign review meetings, but having submitted written comments.
Thank you. On the motion on pages 3 through 7 of the salmon-colored supplement, this requires a 2/3 vote. Those in favor, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. I have 1029. However, we've been at this for 3.5 hours, and you've been very well behaved, and I'll entertain a motion to adjourn town meeting until 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. Is there a second? All in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries. Town meeting is adjourned until 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.